The present moment seems like the most obvious thing in existence, yet it has puzzled the greatest minds in human history. What exactly is now? How long does it last? Is it real or just an illusion created by our minds? These questions have sparked debates that continue today, touching everything from physics to consciousness to the meaning of life itself. This deep exploration will take you through 25 centuries of human thought about the nature of now, revealing why this seemingly simple concept holds the key to understanding reality itself. The stakes of this investigation are higher than they first appear. Your entire life consists of a series of present moments strung together by memory and anticipation. Every decision you make, every relationship you form, every creative act you perform happens in some version of now. If the present moment is an illusion, then your entire existence might be fundamentally different from what you think it is. If the present moment is real but misunderstood, then clarifying its nature could transform how you experience every aspect of your life. The metaphysics of now is not abstract speculation, but an investigation into the ground of your own being. Consider that you have never actually experienced anything except the present moment. Everything you remember about the past is a present moment memory, and everything you imagine about the future is a present moment imagination. Even when you read about historical events or plan for tomorrow, these activities occur in the now. The present moment is not just one time among others, but the only time you have ever known directly. This makes understanding its nature crucial for understanding the nature of experience itself. We will explore how this simple observation leads to some of the most profound and challenging ideas in human thought. Part 1. What makes now special? When you read these words right now, something remarkable is happening that distinguishes this moment from all other moments in history. Your consciousness is experiencing what philosophers call the present moment, but this experience involves layers of complexity that become apparent only under careful examination. The present seems immediate and direct, yet neuroscience reveals that it requires sophisticated processing that takes measurable time to complete. Visual information travels from your eyes to your brain at finite speed, gets processed through multiple neural stages, and only then becomes conscious experience. By the time you become aware of seeing these words, the light that carried them has already completed its journey and been transformed into neural signals. So what you experience as the immediate now actually represents events that occurred roughly 1/10 of a second ago. This temporal lag creates the first deep problem about the nature of now. If your experience of the present always refers to the immediate past, when do you ever actually encounter the present itself? The real present moment, if it exists, seems to remain always just out of reach, hidden behind the processing delays of consciousness. This suggests that the experienced present and the objective present might be completely different phenomena. The now of consciousness could be a construction that gives you access to recent events rather than a direct encounter with current reality. Understanding this distinction becomes crucial for grasping what the present moment actually is versus what it feels like. The temporal structure of consciousness reveals even deeper complexities when examined closely. Your current experience includes not just processed information from the immediate past, but also anticipations and predictions about the immediate future. When you hear someone speaking, your mind predicts what words will come next based on grammar, context, and the speaker's intonation patterns. These predictions influence what you actually hear, sometimes causing you to perceive words that were not actually spoken if they fit your expectations. This means the present moment of consciousness involves a complex integration of past information, current processing, and future prediction. The now is not a simple registration of what is happening, but an active construction that blends temporal information from multiple sources. Consider what happens when you listen to a familiar song. Each note exists for only a brief moment, yet you experience the melody as a unified whole that unfolds through time. This experience requires your consciousness to hold on to notes that have already ended while anticipating notes that have not yet begun. The present moment of musical experience thus extends beyond the current note to include what musicologists call the melodic arc. Without this temporal extension, music would be impossible because each note would exist in complete isolation with no connection to what came before or after. The same principle applies to language, where individual words only make sense as parts of extended sentences and conversations. This reveals that the present moment has what philosophers call intentional structure. Consciousness is always consciousness of something, and this something often has temporal complexity that extends beyond the mathematical instant. When you recognize a friend's face, you are not just seeing current visual patterns, but connecting them to memories of previous encounters and expectations about how your friend typically looks and behaves. The present moment of recognition involves temporal synthesis that brings together information from different times into a unified current understanding. This temporal synthesis is so fundamental to consciousness that it shapes even the most basic perceptual experiences. The now becomes a place where time folds back on itself through memory and forward through anticipation. Yet consciousness also seems capable of experiencing pure present moments that do not obviously involve temporal synthesis. In moments of sudden surprise, intense pain, or overwhelming beauty, awareness can become completely absorbed in immediate experience. These moments feel different from ordinary consciousness because they seem to lack the usual temporal extension into past and future. Athletes describe being in the zone as a state where consciousness becomes completely present without distraction from memory or planning. Artists and musicians report similar states of pure present engagement, where self-conscious temporal awareness disappears entirely. These experiences suggest that consciousness might have access to different modes of temporal experience, including ways of being present that transcend ordinary temporal synthesis. The philosophical question is whether these pure present experiences reveal the true nature of now, or whether they represent unusual modifications of consciousness that temporarily obscure its essentially temporal structure. If consciousness is fundamentally temporal, then pure present experiences might be interesting, but ultimately derivative phenomena. If consciousness can genuinely access non-temporal awareness, then these experiences might reveal dimensions of the present moment that ordinary temporal consciousness cannot reach. This question connects to fundamental issues about whether reality itself is temporal or whether temporality is just one way of organizing experience. The answer shapes whether we should understand the present moment as a feature of objective reality or as a construction of particular types of minds. It also influences whether practices that cultivate present moment awareness are discovering something true about reality or just developing useful psychological skills. Part 2. The Ancient Puzzle. The ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea created paradoxes that revealed how strange time really is, and his insights remain as challenging today as they were 2,500 years ago. His most famous paradox involved an arrow flying through the air, but the deeper issue was about the fundamental nature of motion and change in time. Zeno argued that at any single instant, the arrow occupies a specific location, and is therefore motionless at that instant. Since the arrow's flight consists entirely of such instants, and it is motionless at each instant, how can it ever move at all? This paradox strikes at the heart of what we mean by the present moment, and reveals a deep tension between mathematical and experiential approaches to time. It suggests that either motion is impossible, which contradicts obvious experience, or that our concept of temporal instance is fundamentally flawed. The arrow paradox exposes a crucial problem with treating time as composed of separate moments. If the present moment is truly instantaneous, having zero duration, then nothing can happen within it. Motion requires change of position, but change requires duration, and an instant has no duration. Similarly, thought requires neural processes that unfold over time, but an instant provides no time for processes to unfold. This creates what philosophers call the problem of temporal becoming. How can change occur if time is made up of changeless instants? The paradox reveals that our intuitive notion of discrete present moments might be incompatible with the reality of change and process that we observe everywhere in experience. Zeno developed additional paradoxes that deepened this challenge. In the dichotomy paradox, he argued that before reaching any destination, you must first travel half the distance, but before travelling half the distance, you must first travel a quarter of the distance, and so on infinitely. This creates an infinite series of tasks that must be completed before any motion can begin, suggesting that motion is impossible. The paradox reveals problems with treating space and time as infinitely divisible, while also treating them as composed of discrete parts. If space and time are continuous, then motion seems unproblematic. But if they are discrete, then motion becomes paradoxical. The present moment inherits this fundamental tension between continuity and discreteness that appears throughout mathematics and physics. Aristotle attempted to resolve these paradoxes by developing a sophisticated theory of time as the measure of change. He argued that time is not made up of separate instants, but is continuous like a line that can be divided infinitely without ever reaching indivisible points. For Aristotle, the present moment was like the moving boundary between past and future, similar to how the front of a moving object divides the space ahead from the space behind. This boundary exists and moves, but it has no thickness or duration of its own. The present becomes real as a boundary without being substantial as a thing, resolving the paradox by denying that instants have independent existence. Time exists as continuous change, and the present is just our way of marking where we are in this continuous process. But Aristotle's solution creates new problems while solving old ones. If the present has no duration or substance, then it seems to have no causal power either. How can something with no temporal thickness influence what happens or serve as the arena for decision and action? Moreover, Aristotle's view makes time dependent on change, which raises questions about whether time could exist in a completely unchanging world. If time is the measure of change and nothing changed, would time cease to exist? This connects to deep questions in contemporary physics about whether time is fundamental or emergent, and whether the universe could exist in a timeless state. The ancient Stoics developed yet another approach by arguing that only the present moment truly exists. According to Stoic philosophy, the past has ceased to exist and the future does not yet exist, making the present the only real time. But the Stoics understood the present not as an instant, but as the immediate sphere of action and choice. The present moment is where virtue can be practiced, where reason can be applied to circumstances and where human freedom can be exercised. For the Stoics, the reality of the present was not a metaphysical doctrine, but a practical truth about where human agency operates. You cannot change the past or control the future, but you can respond wisely to present circumstances. This makes the present moment ethically special, even if its metaphysical status remains unclear. The now becomes the domain of responsibility and the arena where character is formed through repeated choices. Part 3. Augustine's mental time. Augustine of Hippo faced the collapse of the Roman world and the rise of Christianity, circumstances that led him to think deeply about the relationship between time and eternity. His analysis of time in the Confessions remains one of the most penetrating investigations of temporal experience ever written. Augustine began with a simple observation that leads to profound conclusions. When we speak about the past or future, we are always speaking in the present. The past event itself is gone forever, but our memory of it exists now. The future event does not yet exist, but our expectation of it exists now. This led Augustine to wonder whether the past and future have any reality independent of present mental activities. Augustine's insight was both psychological and metaphysical. Psychologically, he noticed that temporal experience always involves present mental activities like remembering, perceiving, and anticipating. You never directly encounter the past or future, but only present modifications of consciousness that point toward other times. When you remember your childhood, you are not transported back in time, but are having a current experience with a specific temporal character. Similarly, when you plan for next week, you are engaged in present mental activity rather than somehow reaching into future time. All temporal experience occurs in the now, even when its content refers to other times. Metaphysically, Augustine wondered whether this meant that past and future are nothing more than present mental modifications. Perhaps the past exists only as present remembering, and the future exists only as present anticipating. This would make the present moment ontologically fundamental, the only time that genuinely exists, rather than just the only time we can experience. Everything that was or will be would need to be grounded somehow in what is happening right now. This view, later called presentism, makes the present moment carry an enormous metaphysical burden as the foundation of all temporal reality. It also raises difficult questions about what happens to past events after they stop being present and how future events can be real before they become present. Augustine noticed something deeply puzzling when he tried to measure the duration of the present moment. An hour cannot be entirely present because 59 minutes of it are either past or future at any given moment. The same problem applies to minutes, seconds, and even smaller intervals. No matter how small a duration you consider, most of it will not be genuinely present if you analyze it carefully. This analysis leads toward the conclusion that the present moment has no duration at all, existing as a mathematical instant between past and future. But Augustine realized that this creates an impossible situation where the present becomes nothing at all. The problem deepens when Augustine considered how temporal measurement works. To measure any duration, you must mark its beginning and end, but these marks cannot be simultaneous if there is real duration between them. When you time how long something lasts, you remember when it started and notice when it ends, then compare these memories. But this comparison happens in a present moment that comes after the duration you are measuring has ended. The measurement of time always involves memory rather than direct perception of temporal extension. Augustine concluded that time might exist primarily in the mind as the capacity to hold past and future together in present awareness, rather than in external reality as an independent dimension. This led Augustine to distinguish between human time and divine eternity. Human time involves distension, the stretching of consciousness across past, present and future that creates temporal experience. This distension is necessary for human knowledge and action, but also creates restlessness and anxiety as consciousness gets pulled away from pure presence. Divine eternity involves perfect presence that encompasses everything without temporal extension or succession. From God's eternal perspective, all moments exist simultaneously in perfect immediacy without any temporal separation or flow. Augustine's analysis suggests that temporal experience might be a limitation of finite consciousness rather than a fundamental feature of reality itself. The implications of Augustine's analysis extend far beyond religious concerns. If time exists primarily in consciousness rather than in external reality, then understanding temporal experience becomes crucial for understanding the nature of mind itself. The present moment becomes the place where consciousness creates temporal order from non-temporal reality, rather than where consciousness encounters objective temporal flow. This anticipates much later developments in philosophy and cognitive science that treat time as emergent from more fundamental processes rather than as a basic feature of the world. Augustine's psychological analysis of temporal experience remains relevant today because it reveals features of consciousness that any complete theory must explain. His work shows how careful introspective analysis can reveal problems and possibilities that remain hidden from purely external approaches to time and reality. Part 4. Medieval Solutions. Medieval philosophers inherited Augustine's puzzles about time and developed increasingly sophisticated solutions that anticipate many contemporary debates. Thomas Aquinas created a comprehensive theory that distinguished between different types of temporal existence and different ways of being present. For Aquinas, material objects exist in what he called time, which involves continuous change and movement through successive moments. But rational souls exist in what he called eviternity, a mode of existence that transcends temporal succession while remaining connected to temporal change. This distinction allows consciousness to have a different relationship to the present moment than purely material processes, explaining how minds can integrate temporal information in ways that purely physical systems cannot. The present moment becomes fundamentally different for conscious beings than for unconscious matter. Aquinas developed this distinction by analyzing how different types of beings relate to change and permanence. Purely material things are completely subject to temporal succession, existing only in the current moment of their material configuration. Angels and separated souls exist in eviternity, which involves unchanging essence combined with the ability to act in time through discrete choices. Human beings combine both modes with their material bodies existing in time while their rational souls participate in eviternity. This creates a complex present moment for human consciousness that involves both temporal succession and eviternal permanence. You experience change and flow through your bodily existence while maintaining rational continuity through your soul's participation in a more stable mode of being. The concept of eviternity helps address Augustine's problem about the disappearing present. While the material present has no duration, the eviternal present can encompass extended duration without temporal succession. Think of it like being able to see an entire landscape at once, rather than having to scan across it sequentially. The rational soul can hold together extended temporal information in a single act of understanding that does not itself unfold through time. When you understand a mathematical proof or follow a complex argument, you grasp the logical structure all at once, even though it took time to work through the steps. This timeless understanding represents the soul's participation in eternal presence, which makes extended temporal synthesis possible. Aquinas also distinguished between time and eternity proper, which belongs only to God. Divine eternity involves perfect simultaneity, where everything that ever happens is present at once, without any temporal extension or succession. God does not remember the past or anticipate the future because everything exists in divine presence simultaneously. This makes God's relationship to time fundamentally different from any created being's relationship to time. From the eternal perspective, there is no distinction between past, present, and future because everything is equally immediate. This eternal now provides the metaphysical foundation for temporal succession without itself being temporal. The Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali developed a different but related approach based on the doctrine of continuous creation. According to Al-Ghazali, divine power does not just create the world once and then leave it to operate according to natural laws. Instead, God continuously recreates the entire universe at every moment, sustaining it in existence through constant creative activity. Each present moment represents a complete act of divine creation that brings the world into existence anew. The appearance of temporal continuity emerges from the similarity between successive moments of creation rather than from any inherent temporal flow. This makes each present moment ontologically complete and independent, connected to other moments only through divine will rather than through natural causation. Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, as this theory came to be known, has radical implications for understanding causation and change. What appears to be natural causation is actually divine recreation that follows consistent patterns. When fire appears to burn cotton, God is actually recreating the world without the cotton rather than the fire causing the cotton's destruction. Each present moment involves divine choice about what will exist in the next moment based on established patterns that we call natural laws. This makes the present moment the arena where divine freedom operates within creation rather than just where predetermined natural processes unfold. The now becomes charged with creative possibility because it represents direct divine action rather than just the mechanical operation of natural forces. Medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides offered yet another perspective by arguing that temporal language about God must be understood metaphorically rather than literally. When we say that God knows future events, we are not attributing temporal knowledge to God, but expressing God's perfect knowledge in terms that finite minds can grasp. Divine knowledge does not involve temporal sequence, because God's essence transcends all temporal categories. This creates a complex relationship between eternal divine knowledge and temporal human experience, where the present moment serves as the interface between eternal and temporal perspectives. Human present moments participate in divine eternity while remaining genuinely temporal, creating a bridge between time and timelessness that cannot be fully conceptualized by either temporal or eternal categories alone. The metaphysics of now must somehow accommodate both the reality of temporal experience and its grounding in eternal truth. Part 5. Modern Philosophy's Revolution. Immanuel Kant revolutionized philosophical thinking about time by arguing that temporal experience reveals more about the structure of human cognition than about the nature of reality itself. For Kant, time is not a property of things, as they exist independently of observation, but a pure form of sensible intuition that the human mind brings to experience. This means that temporal succession, duration, and the present moment are features of how human consciousness must organize its experience, rather than features of how reality exists in itself. Time becomes transcendently ideal, which means it is universally necessary for human experience, while not necessarily characterizing reality as it exists apart from human observation. This revolutionary perspective suggests that investigating the present moment is really investigating the deep structure of human consciousness rather than discovering objective temporal facts. The now becomes a window into the mind rather than a feature of the world. Kant's analysis emerged from his attempt to solve fundamental problems in 18th century philosophy about the relationship between experience and reality. Empiricists like David Hume argued that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, but they struggled to explain how experience could justify beliefs about causation, substance and temporal connection. Rationalists like Gottfried Leibniz argued that reason could discover truths about reality independent of experience, but they struggled to explain how rational knowledge could apply to the sensible world. Kant proposed that the mind actively structures experience through pure forms like space and time, rather than just passively receiving sensory data. This active structuring explains how experience can have necessary features like temporal succession, while remaining responsive to empirical input. The present moment becomes a product of this active structuring, rather than a simple given in either experience or reality. Kant's critical philosophy reveals deep problems with treating the present moment as either purely subjective or purely objective. If the present were purely subjective, it could not provide genuine knowledge about an independent world, making science and practical action impossible. If the present were purely objective, it would be unclear how consciousness could access it, or how temporal experience could have the universal features that make communication and shared understanding possible. Kant's solution involves treating temporal experience as objective for all possible human experience, while remaining subjective relative to reality as it might exist apart from any possible human experience. This creates a complex ontological status for the present moment that is neither purely mind-dependent nor purely mind-independent. The now becomes intersubjectively objective, meaning it has genuine reality for conscious beings while potentially being absent from reality as it exists independently of consciousness. Henry Bergson challenged Kant's approach by arguing that real temporal experience reveals genuine features of reality that scientific and mathematical approaches to time cannot capture. Bergson distinguished between time as it appears in physics and mathematics, which treats all moments as equivalent points on a line, and time as it is lived in consciousness, which involves genuine novelty and creativity. Scientific time is spatial, treating temporal intervals like spatial distances that can be measured and divided quantitatively. But lived time is qualitative, involving unique moments that cannot be repeated or exchanged for other moments. When you listen to a melody, each note contributes something irreplaceable to the total experience that cannot be captured by analyzing the temporal intervals between sounds. The present moment in lived time creates genuine novelty rather than just revealing what was already determined by past conditions. Bergson's duration involves interpenetration rather than succession. In mechanical time, each moment is external to every other moment, related only by mathematical relationships of before and after. In duration, Each moment interpenetrates with all others, creating an organic unity where the past lives on in the present, while the present opens creatively towards the future. This interpenetration explains how consciousness can synthesize temporal information without losing the distinctness of different temporal phases. The present moment becomes thick rather than thin, involving the active integration of temporal multiplicity rather than existence at a mathematical point. This thickness is not spatial but intensive, involving degrees of interpenetration and creative synthesis that cannot be measured quantitatively. Edmund Husserl developed the most detailed phenomenological analysis of temporal consciousness in the history of philosophy, revealing complex structures that earlier thinkers had not distinguished. Husserl discovered that what we ordinarily call the present moment actually involves three distinct intentional components that work together to create unified temporal experience. The primal impression provides awareness of what is occurring right now, but this now point has no temporal extension and would create no coherent experience by itself. Retention holds on to what has just occurred, not as memory of the distant past, but as immediate awareness of the just past that remains co-present with the current impression. Pretension anticipates what is about to occur based on current trajectories and expectations, creating openness toward the immediate future that shapes present experience. These three intentional functions operate simultaneously in every conscious moment, creating what Husserl called the living present. Husserl's analysis reveals that consciousness has an intrinsically temporal structure that makes sequential experience possible. Without retention, each impression would exist in complete isolation with no connection to what preceded it, making melody, speech, and narrative impossible. Without pretension, consciousness would be purely reactive, with no capacity for anticipation or preparation, making skilled action and planning impossible. Without primal impression, there would be no anchor in current actuality to prevent consciousness from floating freely among memories and fantasies. The integration of these three functions creates what Husserl called temporal synthesis, the ongoing process by which consciousness creates coherent temporal experience from momentary impressions. This synthesis is not something consciousness does occasionally, but the basic structure of how consciousness operates in every moment. Part 6. Einstein's devastating blow. Einstein's special theory of relativity fundamentally destroyed the common-sense notion of a universal present moment that applies throughout the entire universe. The theory emerged from careful analysis of how electromagnetic phenomena behave when observed from different reference frames moving at constant velocities relative to each other. Einstein discovered that the speed of light remains constant for all observers regardless of their motion, but this constancy requires that measurements of time and space change in ways that seem to violate common sense. When two observers move at high speeds relative to each other, they will disagree about when events happen and even about whether distant events are simultaneous. This relativity of simultaneity eliminates any objective way to define a universal present moment that covers the entire universe at once. The now fragments into countless observer-dependent nows, each equally valid within its own reference frame. The mathematical details of special relativity reveal exactly how the present moment becomes relative. Consider two events that happen at different locations in space, like lightning strikes at opposite ends of a train platform. Someone standing still on the platform might observe these events as perfectly simultaneous, representing a single extended present moment. But someone moving at high speed along the platform will observe one lightning strike as happening before the other, with a definite temporal separation between them. Both observations are equally correct according to the laws of physics, and there is no way to determine which observation reveals the objective temporal relationship. The concept of simultaneity, and therefore the concept of a universal present, becomes meaningless for spatially separated events. This relativity extends beyond simultaneity to affect the entire distinction between past, present and future. Events that lie in your future light cone will be future relative to you regardless of your motion, and events in your past light cone will be past relative to you. But events that lie outside your light cone, meaning that light signals could not connect you to them, have ambiguous temporal status that depends on your reference frame. An event that is in your present according to one reference frame might be in your past or future according to another reference frame. This means that the threefold division of time into past, present and future applies only locally rather than universally. Beyond your immediate light cone, the question of whether something is happening now has no objective answer. General relativity extends these insights by showing how gravity affects the rate of temporal flow itself. Time passes more slowly in stronger gravitational fields, an effect that has been measured with extremely accurate atomic clocks. Someone at the bottom of a deep gravitational well will experience the present moment as lasting longer than someone far from massive objects. Their clocks will run at different rates, and they will disagree about the duration of events even when they agree about their temporal order. This gravitational time dilation shows that not only simultaneity, but also duration and temporal rate are relative to the observer's circumstances. The present moment becomes not just observer relative, but also position relative, varying based on location in space-time. These relativistic effects combine to create what physicists call the block universe or eternal block interpretation of space-time. In this view, all events throughout the history and future of the universe exist equally in a four-dimensional structure where temporal relationships are geometric rather than dynamic. Past, present and future become more like spatial directions such as left, right, up and down, rather than involving genuine temporal becoming. The appearance of temporal flow emerges from the perspective of conscious beings who experience only one three-dimensional slice of this four-dimensional structure at a time. The present moment becomes analogous to here in space, marking where a particular observer happens to be located, rather than identifying something objectively special about that location. This block's universe view eliminates temporal becoming entirely, treating change as a static pattern distributed across space-time rather than as dynamic process occurring in time. The philosophical implications are staggering and remain controversial even among physicists. If the block universe interpretation is correct, then everything that will ever happen has already happened in the sense of existing tenselessly in space-time. Your entire life history, from birth to death, exists as a complete four-dimensional structure that you experience sequentially, but that exists all at once. This seems to eliminate genuine choice, change and temporal becoming, reducing temporal experience to a kind of illusion created by limited perspective. Many philosophers and some physicists resist this conclusion, arguing that relativity does not require eliminating temporal becoming, but only relativizing it to reference frames. The debate continues today with profound implications for understanding free will, moral responsibility, and the ultimate nature of reality. Part 7. The Block Universe Problem. The block universe theory treats time as analogous to space in ways that fundamentally challenge ordinary temporal experience and common-sense notions of change and becoming. Just as all spatial locations exist equally regardless of where you happen to be standing. All temporal locations exist equally regardless of when you happen to be living. Your birth, your current moment of reading these words, and your eventual death are all equally real parts of the four-dimensional space-time manifold. The difference between past, present, and future becomes purely perspectival, like the difference between here and there in space. When you remember yesterday, you are not accessing something that no longer exists, but directing your attention toward a different region of space-time that exists as definitively as your current location. Similarly, your future exists just as definitely as your present, but you cannot access it directly because of the particular way consciousness moves through the temporal dimension. This eternalist interpretation of time solves many puzzles that plague presentist theories while creating new puzzles of its own. It explains why the laws of physics are mostly time-symmetric and why space and time can be unified into a single geometric structure. It makes relativity theory mathematically elegant and avoids the problems of trying to define universal simultaneity across reference frames. The block universe also explains how temporal facts can be objective, even though temporal experience is observer-relative. The fact that all observers disagree about simultaneity does not make temporal relationships arbitrary, because these relationships are encoded geometrically in the space-time structure itself. Different observers trace different paths through this structure, but the structure itself provides objective temporal facts that transcend observer-dependent descriptions. However, the block universe seems to drain temporal experience of much of its apparent significance and meaning. If everything that will happen already exists in space-time, what is the point of effort, planning, or moral concern about future consequences? Your future actions exist just as definitely as past historical events, which seems to eliminate genuine choice and responsibility. The anxiety you feel about uncertain future outcomes becomes irrational because those outcomes already exist and are either good or bad independently of your current concerns. Even death loses its sting because your life continues to exist eternally in space-time even after your biological processes cease. The block universe can seem to reduce human existence to a static pattern, rather than a dynamic process of growth, choice, and creative response. Philosophers have developed sophisticated responses to these worries about fatalism and meaninglessness. The fact that your future exists does not mean it exists independently of your choices and efforts. Your future exists precisely because you will make the choices you make and exert the efforts you exert. The block universe contains your free actions rather than eliminating them, just as a completed novel contains the characters' choices rather than making them irrelevant to the story. Think of space-time like a landscape where your life history traces a particular path through the terrain. The landscape exists as a whole, but your path through it depends on the decisions you make at each point along the way. The block universe provides the stage for choice and action rather than predetermining their outcomes. Your present moment choices help determine which path through space-time your life history will trace. Some philosophers argue that the block universe interpretation goes beyond what relativity theory actually requires. Relativity shows that simultaneity is relative, but this might not eliminate temporal becoming entirely. Perhaps temporal becoming occurs within each reference frame, even though different reference frames disagree about simultaneity across space like intervals. This would preserve genuine temporal flow while acknowledging that this flow is not universally synchronized across the entire universe. The present moment would remain real and dynamic within local reference frames while losing its claim to universal significance. This compromised position attempts to preserve both the insights of relativity and the reality of temporal experience by limiting each to its appropriate domain. Other philosophers embrace the block universe but argue that it does not have the nihilistic implications that critics suggest. Even if all times exist equally, your perspective as a temporally embedded conscious being makes certain times more significant than others relative to your concerns and projects. The present moment retains its special character as the location where you currently find yourself, even if it has no objective temporal privilege. Moreover, the block universe includes all the genuine relationships, achievements, and meaningful experiences that make life valuable, preserving them eternally rather than allowing them to slip away into nothingness. From this perspective, the block universe provides a kind of temporal immortality that preserves rather than threatens the significance of human existence. Every present moment becomes eternally real rather than being lost to the flow of time. Part 8. Consciousness creates time. The relationship between consciousness and temporal experience presents one of the most challenging problems in contemporary philosophy of mind and neuroscience. Conscious experience appears to be essentially temporal, involving the flow of thoughts, sensations, and emotions through a series of present moments. Yet neuroscience reveals that this temporal flow emerges from complex neural processes that operate according to very different principles than the unified temporal stream that consciousness experiences. Different brain regions process information at different speeds and use different temporal frameworks. Yet somehow this distributed processing gets integrated into the coherent temporal experience that defines conscious awareness. Understanding how consciousness creates unified temporal experience from disparate neural processes has become crucial for understanding both the nature of consciousness and the nature of time itself. The present moment becomes a construction achievement rather than a simple given. Research in cognitive neuroscience has revealed that the brain operates through what scientists call predictive processing, constantly generating expectations about what will happen next based on past experience and current sensory input. These predictions occur at multiple temporal scales simultaneously, from millisecond predictions about immediate sensory events to long-term predictions about future goals and outcomes. When something unexpected occurs, the brain generates prediction errors that update its models and create conscious awareness of the surprise. This means your experience of the present moment is actually your brain's current best hypothesis about what is happening right now, rather than direct perception of current reality. The now becomes a continuously updated construction that synthesizes bottom-up sensory information with top-down predictions and expectations. This construction happens so quickly and automatically that it feels like immediate perception, but it actually involves sophisticated computational processes that take measurable time to complete. The temporal binding problem reveals another layer of complexity in how consciousness creates present-moment experience. Different sensory modalities operate at different processing speeds, with vision taking roughly 100 milliseconds from stimulus to conscious perception, audition taking about 50 milliseconds, and touch taking even less time. Yet, when you see lightning and hear thunder, or watch someone speak and hear their voice, these events feel simultaneous even though they involve different processing delays. The brain accomplishes this temporal binding by holding faster information in temporary storage until slower information catches up, then integrating them into unified multimodal present-moment experiences. This binding process requires active neural mechanisms that can be disrupted by brain injuries, alcohol, or certain psychiatric conditions. When temporal binding fails, consciousness fragments into disconnected sensory streams with no coherent present moment to unify them. Studies of patients with specific brain lesions reveal how dependent normal temporal experience is on particular neural mechanisms. Damage to the cerebellum can eliminate the ability to perceive temporal duration accurately, making it impossible to distinguish between intervals of different lengths. Damage to the prefrontal cortex can impair temporal sequencing, making it difficult to maintain coherent narratives or follow complex temporal instructions. Patients with certain types of epilepsy report that seizures can compress hours of experience into moments or expand moments into subjective eternities. These cases demonstrate that the present moment of consciousness depends on the proper functioning of distributed neural networks rather than emerging automatically from any single brain region. They also suggest that normal temporal experience represents just one possible mode of conscious temporal organization rather than the only way consciousness could relate to time. The global workspace theory of consciousness proposes that present moment awareness emerges when information becomes globally available across different brain systems simultaneously. Most neural processing occurs locally within specialized brain regions without reaching conscious awareness. But when information becomes globally broadcast across multiple brain systems, it enters what researchers call the global workspace and becomes consciously accessible. This global broadcasting takes time and requires coordination across brain regions, which helps explain why consciousness always lags slightly behind the events it represents. The present moment becomes defined by this global availability rather than by any particular neural event or brain region. Consciousness creates temporal experience by integrating information across space and time into globally coherent representations that feel immediate despite involving complex processing delays. Recent research on meditation and contemplative practices reveals that consciousness can modify its own temporal structure through training and attention. Experienced meditators show different patterns of neural activity in brain regions associated with temporal processing, attention and self-referential thinking. These changes correlate with reported experiences of expanded present moments, decreased temporal anxiety, and enhanced ability to remain present during difficult circumstances. Brain imaging studies suggest that meditation can actually change the neural mechanisms that create temporal experience, making the present moment more stable and less fragmented. This neuroplasticity of temporal experience indicates that the relationship between consciousness and time is not fixed, but can be modified through practice and training. The present moment becomes something that consciousness can learn to inhabit more skillfully, rather than just something that happens automatically. Part 9. The Quantum Present. Quantum mechanics introduces radical uncertainty into the heart of physical reality that fundamentally challenges classical notions of definite present moments. According to quantum theory, particles do not possess definite properties like position, momentum, or spin until these properties are measured by interaction with measuring apparatus. Before measurement, quantum systems exist in what physicists call superposition, a genuinely indefinite state where multiple incompatible possibilities coexist without any single one being actual. The act of measurement appears to collapse this superposition into a definite classical state where the particle has specific measurable properties. This quantum measurement process might be what creates definite present moments in physical reality, making the now the place where quantum possibilities crystallize into classical actualities. The present becomes the frontier where indefinite quantum reality becomes definite classical reality through the irreversible process of measurement and decoherence. The quantum measurement problem remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in physics and philosophy of science. The mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics describes the evolution of quantum systems with extraordinary precision, but it provides two different rules for how this evolution occurs. When quantum systems are not being measured, they evolve according to the Schrödinger equation, which preserves superposition and maintains multiple coexisting possibilities. But when measurement occurs, the system appears to collapse instantly into a definite state according to probabilistic rules that cannot be derived from the Schrödinger equation. This measurement collapse seems to involve genuine physical discontinuity, where smooth quantum evolution suddenly gives way to abrupt classical definiteness. If this collapse is real, then the present moment in quantum mechanics involves genuine temporal becoming, where new facts come into existence rather than just the revelation of facts that already existed. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a special role in creating present moments through the act of observation. According to these consciousness-based interpretations, quantum superpositions persist until conscious observers make measurements that collapse them into definite states. This would make consciousness a fundamental participant in creating physical reality rather than just a passive observer of independently existing facts. Each conscious observation would represent a moment where mind and matter interact to create new definite facts that did not exist before the interaction occurred. The present moment becomes the interface where consciousness helps determine what becomes actual rather than just discovering what was already actual. This interpretation transforms the metaphysics of now by making consciousness cosmologically significant as a creator of temporal reality rather than just an experiencer of it. However, most contemporary physicists reject consciousness-based interpretations in favor of approaches that explain quantum measurement without requiring minds to play special physical roles. The many worlds interpretation argues that quantum systems never actually collapse, but that conscious observers become correlated with particular branches of an ever-splitting universal wave function. Each measurement creates multiple parallel realities where all possible outcomes actually occur, but consciousness can only access one branch at a time. From this perspective, the present moment involves continuous branching rather than collapse, with countless alternative present moments occurring simultaneously in parallel universes. The now becomes incredibly creative, continuously generating new worlds through quantum choice. But consciousness experiences only one narrow slice of this vast creative process. This interpretation preserves quantum determinism while explaining the appearance of randomness and collapse through conscious limitation rather than physical discontinuity. Alternative approaches focus on quantum decoherence as the mechanism that creates classical present moments without requiring either consciousness or multiple universes. When quantum systems interact with their environment, they lose their delicate superposition properties and become effectively classical through the process of decoherence. This process happens continuously throughout the universe as quantum systems interact with radiation, other particles, and electromagnetic fields. Decoherence creates a continuously advancing frontier of classical reality that emerges from quantum possibility without requiring any special measurement events. The present moment becomes where this decoherence process is currently operating, transforming quantum indefiniteness into classical definiteness through natural physical interaction. This approach makes the now a natural consequence of quantum dynamics rather than requiring consciousness or exotic parallel universes to explain classical experience. TAM, Part 10, Buddhist Impermanence. Buddhist philosophy offers perhaps the most systematic analysis of impermanence and temporal experience in human intellectual history, developed through 2,500 years of contemplative investigation and philosophical reflection. The Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment concerned what Buddhists call the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and no self. These three characteristics are said to apply to all conditioned phenomena without exception, making impermanence a fundamental feature of reality rather than just an obvious observation about particular things that change. According to Buddhist analysis, everything that exists is constantly arising and passing away moment by moment, including what we ordinarily think of as solid objects, stable relationships, and our own continuous selves. The present moment becomes the only place where this universal flux can be observed directly, rather than being obscured by conceptual thinking that imposes false permanence on constantly changing processes. Understanding impermanence correctly is said to eliminate the psychological suffering that comes from trying to grasp what cannot be held. The Buddhist analysis of impermanence operates at multiple levels of temporal analysis that reveal different aspects of how change occurs. At the grossest level, obvious changes like birth, aging, and death demonstrate that all living beings are subject to temporal process that cannot be stopped or reversed. At a subtler level, moment-to-moment changes in thoughts, emotions, and sensations reveal that even apparently stable mental states are actually dynamic processes. At the most subtle level, advanced meditation practitioners report perceiving reality as composed of discrete, momentary events that arise and pass away with extraordinary rapidity. These momentary dharmas, or mind moments, are said to be the ultimate constituents of experience, arising from causes and conditions and immediately ceasing to exist. Each present moment consists of countless such momentary events that create the appearance of continuity through their rapid succession, like frames in a movie, creating the illusion of smooth motion. This momentary analysis connects to sophisticated philosophical theories about causation and temporal continuity that anticipate many contemporary debates in philosophy of mind. If experience consists of discrete moments that immediately cease to exist, how can there be causal connections between different moments? Buddhist philosophers developed the theory of momentary causation, which argues that each moment creates conditions that influence but do not determine subsequent moments. Causation becomes a relationship between discrete events rather than a continuous process, and temporal continuity emerges from causal conditioning rather than from substantial persistence through time. This analysis applies not just to external objects, but to personal identity itself, which becomes a series of causally connected but substantially distinct momentary experiences, rather than a single thing that persists through temporal change. The self becomes a process rather than an entity, and the present moment becomes where this process is currently manifesting rather than where a permanent self is located. Buddhist meditation practices are designed to cultivate direct perception of impermanence rather than just intellectual understanding of it. Mindfulness meditation involves paying careful attention to immediate experience without trying to control or conceptualize what arises. Practitioners learn to observe thoughts appearing and disappearing, emotions arising and subsiding, and physical sensations coming and going without identifying with these temporary phenomena. This observation reveals that what we ordinarily take to be solid and permanent is actually fluid and transitory. Advanced practitioners report that sustained mindfulness can lead to perception of reality as a constantly arising and ceasing flow of momentary events, with no underlying permanent substance. This direct perception of impermanence is said to eliminate the psychological grasping that creates suffering by revealing that there is nothing permanent to grasp. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence leads to a distinctive approach to ethics and the meaning of life. If everything is constantly changing, then attachment to particular outcomes, possessions, or even relationships becomes a source of inevitable disappointment. Wisdom involves learning to engage fully with present circumstances while remaining unattached to their continuation or repetition. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent, but rather learning to act skillfully without being driven by craving for permanent satisfaction. The present moment becomes precious precisely because it is transitory, requiring full attention and appreciation because it will never occur again in exactly the same way. This perspective transforms temporal experience from a problem to be solved into a gift to be received with awareness and gratitude. The doctrine of dependent origination provides the metaphysical foundation for Buddhist impermanence by explaining how temporary phenomena can exist without permanent substance. Everything that exists arises in dependence upon causes and conditions and ceases when those causes and conditions change. Nothing exists independently or permanently, but everything exists interdependently as part of a vast web of relationships that extends across space and time. The present moment becomes a node in this web where countless causal influences converge to create current experience, which then becomes part of the causal conditions for future moments. This interdependent understanding of the present eliminates both eternalism, which treats things as permanently existing, and nihilism, which denies that anything exists at all. The middle way acknowledges that things exist temporarily and conditionally, making the present moment real but not permanent, significant but not eternal. Part 11. Heidegger's Temporal Being. Martin Heidegger argued that traditional Western philosophy had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of time by treating it as a container or dimension in which beings exist, rather than recognizing temporality as the fundamental structure of being itself. According to Heidegger, human existence is not something that happens in time, but something that is essentially and irreducibly temporal. This means that past, present and future are not external coordinates that locate human experience, but internal structures that constitute what it means to exist as the particular type of being that humans are. Heidegger called human being Dasein, literally being there, to emphasize that human existence is always situated in particular temporal and spatial contexts that shape its possibilities. The present moment cannot be understood abstractly, but only in terms of how it emerges from particular historical circumstances and opens toward particular future possibilities. This makes temporality existential rather than cosmological, more about the structure of human existence than about the nature of time as a universal dimension. Heidegger introduced the concept of thrownness to describe how the past constitutes rather than just influences present existence. You are thrown into existence without choosing your historical era, cultural context, family background, or initial life circumstances. This thrownness is not just an external limitation, but an internal feature of your being that shapes every present moment throughout your existence. You cannot step outside your historical situation to view it objectively, because your capacity for objectivity itself emerges from and remains shaped by that situation. The present moment is always already coloured by where you come from and what you have inherited, making pure presence impossible. Every now carries forward the accumulated weight of your personal and cultural history in ways that influence what you can perceive, think and choose. At the same time, human existence essentially involves what Heidegger called projection toward future possibilities. You do not just exist in the present, but are always living ahead of yourself toward possibilities that give meaning to current actions and experiences. These possibilities are not arbitrary fantasies, but concrete options that emerge from your current situation and capabilities. When you choose a career, form relationships, or make moral commitments, you are projecting yourself toward possible ways of being that do not yet exist, but that organize and motivate present activities. This projection is not optional, but constitutes the basic structure of human temporality. You exist as possibility rather than just as actuality, and the present moment gains its significance from the future possibilities toward which it is oriented. The integration of thrownness and projection creates what Heidegger called the moment of vision, an authentic mode of present existence that owns up to both historical limitations and future possibilities. The moment of vision is not just any present moment, but a present that grasps its situation clearly and acts decisively based on this understanding. Most of the time, human existence involves what Heidegger called falling, a tendency to flee from authentic temporality into distraction, busy work, and conformity with social expectations. Falling involves losing yourself in the they-self, the anonymous public interpretation of existence that avoids confronting the anxiety of finite freedom. The moment of vision represents the possibility of retrieving authentic existence from this falling tendency, but it requires courage to face both your limitations and your responsibility for choosing among genuine alternatives. This authentic present is rare and difficult because it demands acknowledging mortality, finitude, and the groundlessness of existence. Heidegger's analysis of temporality reveals that anxiety plays a fundamental role in disclosing the structure of human existence. Anxiety differs from fear because it has no specific object, but rather discloses the general structure of being thrown into an uncertain world with responsibility for choosing among possibilities. This anxiety is not a psychological problem to be solved, but an ontological mood that reveals the temporal structure of human being. In anxiety, you become aware of your existence as stretched between an inherited past that you did not choose and an open future that you must choose without ultimate foundation. The present moment in anxiety becomes charged with significance as the place where this temporal stretch is experienced most acutely. Authentic existence involves learning to inhabit this anxious temporality rather than fleeing from it into false securities and distractions. The political and historical dimensions of Heidegger's analysis reveal how individual temporal experience connects to larger cultural and historical processes. Your thrownness includes not just personal history, but the historical epoch into which you are born with its particular possibilities and limitations. The present moment is never purely individual, but always involves participation in historical processes that extend far beyond personal lifespan. Understanding your historical situation becomes crucial for authentic existence because it reveals both what you inherit from the past and what possibilities remain open for the future. Heidegger argued that modernity involves a particular form of falling that conceals temporality through technological approaches that treat time as a resource to be managed rather than as the fundamental structure of existence. Recovering authentic relationship to temporality requires thinking through the historical development of this technological understanding and opening alternative possibilities for relating to time. Part 12. The Neuroscience of Now. Contemporary neuroscience has revealed extraordinary details about how the brain constructs our experience of the present moment, showing that what feels like immediate awareness actually results from complex neural processes that integrate information across multiple temporal scales. Different sensory systems operate according to different temporal principles, yet consciousness successfully integrates them into unified present-moment experiences that feel coherent and simultaneous. Visual processing involves parallel streams that extract different features like color, motion, shape and depth at different speeds, with some visual computations completing in 50 milliseconds, while others require several hundred milliseconds. Auditory processing can track temporal patterns with microsecond precision, while also extracting higher-level features like melody and speech that require integration across much longer time windows. The brain must somehow synchronize these different temporal streams to create the unified multisensory present that characterizes normal conscious experience. This synchronization represents one of the most remarkable achievements of neural information processing. The discovery of neural oscillations has revealed that the brain uses rhythmic activity patterns to coordinate information processing across different regions and temporal scales. Different types of brain waves operate at different frequencies, from slow delta waves that cycle once per second to fast gamma waves that cycle 40 times per second or more. These oscillations appear to serve as temporal frameworks that allow different brain regions to coordinate their activity and share information effectively. When you pay attention to something, gamma oscillations synchronize across brain regions that are processing relevant information, creating windows of enhanced communication between otherwise independent neural systems. This neural synchronization might be what creates the unified present moment of conscious attention from the distributed processing of multiple brain systems. The now becomes a product of neural coordination rather than a simple input that the brain passively receives. Research on temporal illusions reveals how constructed and malleable the present moment actually is. The color-fi phenomenon shows that the brain can retroactively modify conscious experience based on information that arrives after an event has already been processed. When two colored dots flash in sequence at nearby locations, people often see a single dot that appears to move and change color smoothly between the locations. This requires the brain to somehow go back and modify the experience of the first dot based on information from the second dot that arrives later. The conscious experience that emerges does not correspond to the actual temporal sequence of physical events, but represents a constructed narrative that makes sense of the total information pattern. This suggests that the present moment of consciousness involves active interpretation and construction rather than passive reception of temporal information. Studies of patients with brain lesions provide dramatic evidence for how dependent normal temporal experience is on specific neural mechanisms. Damage to the cerebellum can eliminate temporal discrimination abilities, making it impossible to distinguish between durations that differ by substantial amounts. Patients with cerebellar damage might be unable to tell whether a sound lasted 1 second or 5 seconds, even though their other cognitive abilities remain intact. Damage to the right parietal cortex can eliminate temporal attention, making it impossible to focus on temporal features of experience, even when they can be detected. Some stroke patients lose the ability to experience temporal flow entirely, living in a series of disconnected moments with no sense of continuity or narrative connection. These cases reveal that our ordinary sense of living in a flowing present depends on the integrated function of multiple brain systems working together. The neuroscience of meditation provides insights into how contemplative practices modify the neural basis of temporal experience. Brain imaging studies of experienced meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network, a set of brain regions that typically maintain self-referential thinking and temporal projection. During deep meditative states, activity in these regions drops dramatically while attention networks become more active and stable. These neural changes correlate with reported experiences of expanded present moments where the usual sense of temporal flow diminishes or disappears entirely. Long-term meditation practice appears to create lasting changes in brain structure and function that enhance the capacity for present moment awareness. This neuroplasticity suggests that the relationship between consciousness and temporality is not fixed, but can be modified through training and practice. Recent research on psychedelic substances has revealed that profound alterations in temporal experience can result from specific changes in brain chemistry and neural connectivity. Psilocybin and LSD can create experiences where hours of subjective time occur within minutes of clock time, or where the distinction between past, present and future dissolves entirely. These substances appear to disrupt the default mode network and increase connectivity between brain regions that normally operate independently. The resulting experiences often involve a sense of timeless presence that feels more fundamental than ordinary temporal consciousness. While these are temporary pharmacological effects, they suggest that consciousness might be capable of accessing different temporal dimensions under appropriate circumstances. They also raise questions about whether ordinary temporal experience represents the only possible way for consciousness to relate to time, or whether it represents just one mode among others. Part 13. Meditation and the Timeless Now. Contemplative traditions across cultures report experiences that seem to transcend ordinary temporal limitations, suggesting that consciousness might have access to dimensions of the present that are not available to normal waking awareness. These experiences involve what practitioners describe as entering a timeless now that encompasses all temporal moments simultaneously without temporal extension or succession. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart describe this as participation in the eternal now of God, where divine presence contains all times without being limited by temporal sequence. Islamic Sufis like Ibn Arabi spoke of the eternal moment where individual consciousness dissolves into divine consciousness and experiences reality from an eternal rather than temporal perspective. Hindu and Buddhist contemplatives describe states of samadhi or jhana where the distinction between past, present and future disappears entirely, leaving only pure awareness without temporal characteristics. These reports suggest that consciousness might be capable of accessing non-temporal dimensions of reality that are normally hidden by ordinary temporal experience. The phenomenology of these timeless experiences shares certain features across different traditions, despite significant differences in conceptual interpretation and cultural context. Practitioners consistently report that these states involve a sense of perfect presence that is not located at any particular temporal coordinate, but somehow encompasses all possible present moments. Time does not stop or slow down, but rather becomes irrelevant as a category for organizing experience. The experience often involves a sense of coming home to what was always already present rather than entering an exotic altered state. Many contemplatives describe it as recognizing the timeless awareness that was always the background of temporal experience, but that ordinarily remains unnoticed because attention gets absorbed in changing contents. The timeless now represents not an escape from time, but the discovery of time's ultimate ground in changeless awareness. However, Interpreting these experiences raises complex philosophical and scientific questions about the relationship between subjective reports and objective reality. Neuroscience shows that mystical experiences involve specific patterns of brain activity, particularly decreased activity in brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and temporal processing. The posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex, which normally maintain the sense of narrative self-continuity through time, show dramatically reduced activity during states of timeless awareness. This could mean that timeless experiences result from the temporary shutdown of normal temporal processing mechanisms rather than access to genuinely non-temporal dimensions of reality. The brain might create the illusion of timelessness by disrupting its usual construction of temporal experience rather than revealing eternal features of consciousness or reality. From this perspective, mystical experiences would be interesting neurological phenomena, but would not provide reliable information about the ultimate nature of time. Yet, contemplatives argue that this scientific explanation misses something essential about the experience itself that cannot be captured by studying neural correlates. Even if timeless awareness depends on particular brain states, this does not necessarily mean that it reveals nothing true about the nature of consciousness or reality. Consider the analogy of using a telescope to observe distant stars. The fact that astronomical observation depends on particular optical instruments does not mean that the stars exist only in the telescope. Similarly, the fact that timeless awareness correlates with specific brain states does not necessarily mean that this awareness reveals only features of brain activity rather than features of consciousness or reality that are normally inaccessible. The contemplative claim is that these altered states remove normal limitations rather than creating artificial experiences, allowing consciousness to discover its own timeless nature that is ordinarily obscured by temporal activity. This debate touches fundamental questions about whether consciousness is reducible to neural activity or whether neural activity provides access to consciousness without exhausting its nature. The practical implications of timeless present experiences extend beyond their metaphysical interpretation to influence how practitioners relate to ordinary temporal existence. People who have experienced states of timeless awareness often report lasting changes in their relationship to anxiety, mortality, and the meaning of daily activities. Having experienced presence that transcends temporal flow can reduce the compulsive future orientation that creates much psychological suffering in ordinary life. It can also provide a sense of continuity and meaning that does not depend on achieving particular temporal goals or maintaining particular temporal circumstances. Even if these experiences do not reveal literal timelessness, they appear to modify the neural and psychological patterns that create temporal anxiety and restlessness. The timeless now becomes therapeutically significant, regardless of its ultimate metaphysical status, because it demonstrates alternative ways of inhabiting temporal existence. Part 14. The Emergence Theory. Emergence theory offers a sophisticated framework for understanding how the present moment can be both grounded in physical processes and irreducible to them, providing a middle path between eliminative materialism and substance dualism. According to emergence theory, complex systems can exhibit properties and behaviors that are not present in their individual components, but that arise from the organized interactions between those components. Just as wetness emerges from the collective behavior of water molecules without being present in individual molecules, temporal experience might emerge from the organized activity of neural networks without being present in individual neurons. This emergence is not just epistemological, meaning that we cannot predict higher-level properties from lower-level properties, but ontological, meaning that genuinely new levels of reality come into existence through emergent processes. The present moment becomes a real feature of reality at the level of conscious systems, even if it has no counterpart at the level of fundamental physics. This allows temporal experience to have genuine causal power while remaining naturally grounded, rather than requiring non-physical substances or properties. Strong emergence involves what philosophers call downward causation, where higher-level properties influence the behavior of lower-level components in ways that cannot be reduced to bottom-up causation alone. In the case of consciousness and temporal experience, this might mean that present-moment awareness can influence neural activity in ways that pure neuroscience cannot fully predict or explain. Consider how deciding to pay attention to your breathing can immediately change patterns of neural activity throughout your brain and body. The decision emerges from neural activity, but then influences that same neural activity in ways that seem to involve top-down causation from the mental to the physical level. The present moment becomes causally active as the level where conscious intentions influence neural processes, rather than just passively emerging from them. This creates a genuinely interactive relationship between consciousness and brain activity, where each level influences the other through emergent downward causation. Emergence theory suggests that different levels of reality operate according to different temporal principles that cannot be reduced to a single fundamental temporal framework. At the quantum level, time might be discrete, discontinuous, or even absent altogether, according to some interpretations of quantum gravity theories. At the level of classical physics, time flows continuously according to relativistic principles that make simultaneity relative to reference frames. At the biological level, time involves cycles, rhythms, development and aging that create temporal patterns not present in pure physics. At the psychological level, time involves memory, anticipation and present moment synthesis that create temporal experience with qualitative features absent from biological rhythms. At the cultural level, time involves historical meaning, social coordination and symbolic systems that create temporal significance transcending individual psychology. Each emergent level has genuine reality and causal power within its own domain while remaining grounded in lower levels through natural processes. The present moment of consciousness is as real as the present moment of physics, but it operates according to different principles and serves different functions in the overall structure of reality. This multi-level approach avoids both the reduction of consciousness to mere brain activity and the separation of consciousness from natural processes entirely. It also explains how temporal experience can have features like intentionality, meaning and value that are absent from pure physical temporality without requiring non-natural explanations. The now becomes multiply realizable across different levels of organization, with each level contributing its own temporal characteristics to the total phenomenon. This allows for a rich understanding of how different aspects of reality contribute to present moment experience while maintaining naturalistic coherence. Emergent approaches to consciousness and temporality connect to broader questions in philosophy of mind about how mental phenomena relate to physical phenomena. The hard problem of consciousness asks how subjective experience can arise from objective neural processes, and the present moment represents a particularly challenging case because temporal experience seems so fundamental to subjectivity. If consciousness emerges from neural activity, then temporal experience must somehow emerge from neural temporal processes. But the relationship between neural timing and experience temporality remains mysterious. Emergence theory suggests that this relationship involves genuine novelty rather than simple correlation, with conscious temporality representing a new level of temporal organization that transcends while remaining grounded in neural temporality. This makes the present moment of consciousness a genuine addition to reality, rather than just a redescription of what already exists at lower levels. Understanding emergence becomes crucial for defending the reality and significance of conscious, temporal experience within a naturalistic worldview. Part 15. Free Will and Determinism. The nature of the present moment connects intimately to fundamental questions about human freedom and moral responsibility, making temporal metaphysics relevant to ethics and practical life in ways that might not be immediately obvious. If the present moment is just the moving boundary between a fixed past and a predetermined future, then human choice appears to be illusory, because decisions simply reveal what was already determined by prior causes. But if the present involves genuine openness, where multiple alternative futures remain possible until choices are made, then human agency might have real causal power to influence what becomes actual. The metaphysics of now directly impacts whether human beings are genuine agents who can take responsibility for their actions, or just sophisticated automata who experience the illusion of choice while their behavior unfolds according to natural law. This makes philosophical analysis of temporal experience crucial for understanding human nature and moral responsibility, rather than just academic speculation about abstract temporal concepts. The reality and character of the present moment determines whether human life has the meaning and responsibility that ethical thinking presupposes. Hard determinism argues that human choice is incompatible with the causal closure of the physical world, making the present moment the place where you discover what was already determined rather than where you create new possibilities. According to this view, every event, including human decisions, results from prior causes according to natural laws that leave no room for genuine alternatives. Your experience of deliberating between options and choosing freely represents ignorance about the causal factors that are actually determining your behavior rather than evidence for real causal power. The present moment becomes epistemologically significant as where you learn what you will do, but ontologically impotent as a source of genuine novelty. From this perspective, moral responsibility becomes problematic because people cannot be truly responsible for actions that result from factors ultimately beyond their control. Hard determinists often argue that recognizing this truth about human nature should lead to more compassionate social policies that focus on rehabilitation rather than retribution. Libertarian theories of free will require that the present moment involve genuine agent causation, where conscious beings can initiate new causal chains rather than just continuing existing ones. According to libertarian theories, when you deliberate between alternatives and make a choice, something genuinely new enters the world that was not determined by the totality of prior conditions. This requires that the present moment be metaphysically open, involving real indeterminacy that conscious choice can resolve in favor of particular outcomes. Some libertarians argue that quantum indeterminacy provides the necessary openness for agent causation, suggesting that consciousness might influence quantum processes in ways that amplify microscopic indeterminacy into macroscopic behavioral differences. The present moment becomes where quantum possibilities get resolved through conscious choice, rather than through random collapse or environmental decoherence. This makes consciousness a fundamental feature of physical reality, rather than just an emergent property of complex information processing. Compatibilist theories attempt to preserve moral responsibility within a deterministic framework by redefining what freedom requires, rather than arguing that determinism is false. According to sophisticated compatibilism, freedom does not require the ability to have done otherwise in some ultimate metaphysical sense, but rather requires that actions flow from the agent's own desires, values, and rational reflection. The present moment becomes where your deeper character and commitments express themselves through choice and action, even if these expressions are causally determined by your history and circumstances. What matters is that the causal chain runs through your own mental processes rather than bypassing them, making your decisions genuinely yours, even if they are not ultimately undetermined. This view treats freedom as a feature of how actions relate to agency rather than as a feature of temporal metaphysics, allowing moral responsibility to coexist with natural law. The now becomes where authentic selfhood manifests rather than where ultimate creativity occurs. Recent developments in neuroscience have complicated the free will debate by revealing that conscious decisions often occur after brain activity that predicts those decisions has already begun. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments showed that measurable brain activity begins several hundred milliseconds before people report becoming aware of their intention to move. This suggests that conscious choice might be more about ratifying decisions that have already been made unconsciously rather than initiating action from scratch. However, Libet also found evidence for what he called free won't. The ability to consciously veto actions after unconscious initiation has begun but before they are executed. This preserves a role for conscious agency in controlling behavior, even if it eliminates the role of consciousness in initiating behavior. The present moment becomes where consciousness exercises editorial control over unconscious processes rather than where it exercises creative control over future possibilities. These neuroscientific findings connect to philosophical questions about the relationship between conscious and unconscious mental processes in temporal experience. Much of what shapes your current experience and future behavior occurs outside conscious awareness, including emotional responses, memory consolidation, and behavioral preparation. The present moment of consciousness might represent only the tip of an iceberg of temporal processing that occurs throughout the nervous system. Understanding free will and moral responsibility requires understanding how conscious and unconscious processes interact to create integrated temporal agency rather than focusing only on conscious decision-making. The now becomes a complex achievement of neural integration rather than a simple arena where conscious will operates independently. This complexity does not necessarily eliminate moral responsibility, but it does require more sophisticated understanding of what responsibility means for beings whose agency emerges from the interaction of conscious and unconscious temporal processes. Part 16. The Arrow of Time. One of the most profound mysteries about temporal experience is why time appears to have a definite direction that distinguishes past from future, even though the fundamental laws of physics are largely time-symmetric and work equally well in either temporal direction. The equations that describe electromagnetic phenomena, gravitational interactions, and even most quantum mechanical processes remain valid if you reverse the direction of time, replacing future with past and past with future. Yet our experience reveals a clear arrow pointing from past to future that seems unidirectional and irreversible. We remember the past but not the future. We see causes leading to effects but never effects leading to causes, and we observe increasing disorder and entropy throughout natural processes. The present moment seems to be the moving tip of this temporal arrow, the place where the future constantly transforms into the past through irreversible change. Understanding why time has this directional character might reveal something fundamental about the nature of now and its relationship to physical reality. The second law of thermodynamics provides the most widely accepted explanation for the thermodynamic arrow of time that points toward increasing entropy or disorder. This law states that in any isolated system, entropy tends to increase over time until the system reaches maximum entropy or thermal equilibrium. A broken egg never spontaneously reassembles itself, even though the microscopic laws governing molecular motion would not forbid such reassembly. The statistical improbability of spontaneous organization creates a clear distinction between past states of lower entropy and future states of higher entropy. The present moment becomes the place where entropy is currently increasing, representing the moving frontier between organized past and disorganized future. This thermodynamic understanding makes the now significant as the location of irreversible physical processes, rather than just as the location of conscious experience. However, the thermodynamic arrow raises deep questions about the relationship between fundamental physics and emergent temporal phenomena. The second law of thermodynamics is statistical rather than absolute, describing what happens in overwhelmingly most cases rather than what must happen in every case. Small systems can spontaneously decrease in entropy, and even large systems could theoretically return to previous low-entropy states given sufficient time and improbable fluctuations. Moreover, the second law requires initial conditions where the universe began in a low-entropy state. But fundamental physics provides no explanation for why such special initial conditions should have existed. This makes the thermodynamic arrow dependent on cosmological boundary conditions that seem arbitrary from the perspective of fundamental physical law. The present moment inherits this dependence on initial conditions, making its directional character contingent rather than necessary. The cosmological arrow of time connects the thermodynamic arrow to the large-scale structure and evolution of the universe itself. The universe appears to have begun in a highly organized low-entropy state at the Big Bang, and has been evolving toward higher entropy ever since through cosmic expansion and structure formation. This cosmological evolution creates a universal temporal direction that aligns with local thermodynamic processes and might provide the boundary conditions that make the thermodynamic arrow possible. The formation of galaxies, stars and planets represents temporary decreases in gravitational entropy that are more than compensated by increases in thermal entropy through nuclear fusion and radiation. The present moment becomes embedded in this cosmic temporal narrative, representing where the universe currently finds itself in its evolution from initial simplicity toward final complexity and thermal death. This cosmic perspective makes each present moment part of a universal story that began billions of years ago and will continue for billions of years into the future. The electromagnetic arrow of time emerges from the fact that electromagnetic radiation propagates outward from sources rather than converging on them from distant locations. When you turn on a light, electromagnetic waves spread outward in all directions, carrying energy and information away from the source. The time-reversed process, where electromagnetic waves spontaneously converge from all directions to create organized illumination at a particular location, never occurs, even though it would be consistent with Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism. This electromagnetic asymmetry is related to thermodynamic considerations because convergent electromagnetic waves would require incredibly precise coordination of distant events that become statistically impossible in practice. The present moment becomes where electromagnetic information gets created and dispersed, rather than where it gets gathered and concentrated, giving temporal experience a definite informational direction. This electromagnetic arrow influences everything from perception to communication to astronomical observation, making the directionality of time relevant to how conscious beings can gain information about their environment. The psychological arrow of time emerges from the irreversible processes of memory formation, learning and neural development that create clear distinctions between past and future in conscious experience. Each conscious moment involves the irreversible encoding of new information in neural networks, creating memories that provide access to past events while having no counterpart that provides access to future events. This asymmetry between memory and precognition creates a psychological distinction between past and future that might be independent of physical temporal asymmetries. Even in a time-symmetric physical universe, conscious beings might create temporal arrows through their information processing activities. The present moment becomes where consciousness writes the history of its own experience through observation, memory formation, and learning processes that operate in only one temporal direction. This psychological arrow might be what gives temporal experience its subjective directional character, even if objective physical time lacks inherent direction. Part 17. Non-linear time. While Western philosophical traditions have generally assumed that time flows in a single linear direction from past through present to future, many other cultural traditions have developed radically different temporal concepts that reveal alternative possibilities for understanding the present moment. Cyclical time concepts treat temporal flow as returning to previous states rather than progressing towards entirely new ones. Many indigenous cultures understand time as involving recurring patterns that connect current events to ancestral wisdom and future generations, in cycles that transcend individual lifespans. The present moment in cyclical time is not an isolated point moving along a line, but a phase in recurring processes that have happened before and will happen again. This cyclical understanding makes the present moment richer and more meaningful because it participates in larger temporal structures that extend beyond immediate experience. Current events echo past events while preparing for future repetitions, creating a thick present that includes temporal relationships invisible to linear time concepts. The Hindu concept of cyclical cosmic time involves vast temporal scales that dwarf human historical experience while providing frameworks for understanding how present moments relate to eternal processes. According to traditional Hindu cosmology, the universe goes through repeated cycles of creation, preservation, and destruction that last billions of years. Within these cosmic cycles, smaller cycles govern everything from seasonal changes to individual lifetimes to historical ages with different spiritual and material characteristics. Each present moment occurs within multiple overlapping cycles simultaneously, from the daily cycle of sunrise and sunset to the cosmic cycle of universal creation and dissolution. This nested cyclical structure makes every present moment both unique and repetitive, occurring for the first time within its immediate context while participating in eternal patterns that transcend temporal particularity. The now becomes simultaneously novel and eternal, creative and repetitive, individual and universal. Indigenous Australian concepts of the dream time represent perhaps the most radical alternative to linear temporal thinking found in any human culture. The dream time is not a past era that ended before current history began, but an eternal present that remains accessible through ritual, ceremony, and connection to sacred landscapes. Ancestral beings who shaped the land during the dream time continue to be present in rocks, water sources, animal species, and ceremonial objects. Present moment experience can involve direct participation in dreamtime events through proper ritual preparation and cultural knowledge. This makes the present moment a gateway to eternal spiritual realities rather than just a temporary phase in linear historical development. The now becomes multidimensional, involving simultaneous participation in historical time and mythic time that operate according to completely different principles. Modern physics has discovered phenomena that support non-linear temporal concepts by revealing how time can branch, loop, or operate according to multiple simultaneous frameworks. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that reality continuously branches into parallel timelines whenever quantum measurements occur. Each present moment represents a branching point where multiple alternative futures split off from a common past, creating a tree-like temporal structure rather than a single linear progression. From this perspective, your consciousness follows one particular branch through an enormous space of parallel possibilities, but other versions of yourself follow different branches where different choices were made and different outcomes occurred. The present moment becomes incredibly creative, continuously generating new worlds through quantum choice processes that operate below the level of conscious awareness. This branching temporality makes the now a fountain of alternative realities rather than a single point in linear historical progression. Closed time-like curves represent another possibility suggested by general relativity, where time can loop back on itself under extreme conditions involving massive rotating objects or exotic matter configurations. If such curves existed, it would be possible in principle to travel into your own past and influence events that had already occurred from your original temporal perspective. This creates apparent paradoxes like the grandfather paradox, where you might prevent your own birth by interfering with your grandparents' meeting. Various solutions have been proposed, including the Novikov self-consistency principle, which argues that the universe would arrange itself to prevent paradoxical outcomes from occurring. While closed, time-like curves remain highly speculative, their theoretical possibility reveals that linear temporal progression might not be as fundamental as common sense suggests. The present moment might be capable of reaching back to influence its own past under appropriate circumstances. Discrete temporal theories propose that time might be fundamentally granular rather than continuous, consisting of separate temporal atoms with no time between them. This digital approach to time treats reality like a sequence of movie frames or computational steps, with each present moment representing a complete snapshot of universal state. Temporal flow would emerge from the sequence of these discrete states rather than involving continuous change within temporal intervals. Each frame would be connected to adjacent frames through similarity and causal laws rather than through temporal continuity, making causation a relationship between discrete events rather than a continuous process. This granular temporality makes each present moment indivisible and atomic, the smallest possible unit of temporal existence that cannot be further subdivided. The now becomes digitized rather than analog, involving discrete choices between alternative possible subsequent frames, rather than continuous evolution according to differential equations. Part 18. The Phenomenology of Duration. The lived experience of temporal duration reveals dramatic variations that expose the constructed nature of present moment experience while raising fundamental questions about the relationship between subjective and objective temporal measurement. Minutes can feel like hours when you are anxiously waiting for important news or enduring physical pain. Hours can feel like minutes when you are deeply engaged in absorbing activities or enjoying pleasant social interaction. These variations in subjective duration cannot be explained simply by changes in attention or memory because they involve systematic distortions that follow predictable patterns across different types of experience. The metaphysics of now must account for this temporal elasticity by explaining how the same objective duration can correspond to radically different subjective experiences. This suggests that the present moment is not a fixed quantity but something that expands and contracts based on the quality and intensity of conscious engagement. Psychological research has identified specific factors that influence subjective temporal duration in systematic ways that reveal principles governing how consciousness constructs temporal experience. Novel experiences feel longer in retrospect than routine experiences of the same objective duration because novel experiences create more distinct memories that serve as temporal landmarks. When you travel to a new place or learn a new skill, the day feels packed with experience and seems to last longer than ordinary days filled with familiar routine. Emotional intensity also expands subjective duration, with highly emotional moments feeling extended while emotionally neutral periods feel compressed. Attention plays a crucial role, with focused attention expanding experience duration while divided attention compresses it. These effects suggest that consciousness actively constructs temporal duration rather than passively measuring objective temporal intervals. The proportional theory of temporal experience attempts to explain why childhood years feel much longer than adult years by relating subjective duration to total life experience. For a 5-year-old child, 1 year represents 20% of their entire existence, while for a 50-year-old adult, 1 year represents only 2% of their accumulated life experience. This proportional relationship might explain why early memories feel more temporally distant and why time seems to accelerate as people age. However, the proportional theory cannot explain moment-to-moment variations in temporal experience or the fact that some recent experiences feel more distant than older experiences. It also fails to account for how attention, emotion and novelty influence subjective duration independently of chronological considerations. This suggests that multiple mechanisms contribute to temporal experience, with proportional effects representing only one factor among many that influence how consciousness constructs duration. Altered states of consciousness can completely transform temporal experience in ways that reveal the normal constraints operating on ordinary present moment awareness. Under general anesthesia, hours can pass without any subjective duration at all, suggesting that temporal experience requires specific types of neural activity that can be chemically suppressed. During epileptic seizures, patients sometimes report experiencing entire lifetimes of detailed experience within seconds of clock time, or conversely feeling that brief seizures lasted for days or weeks. Psychedelic substances can create experiences where linear temporal sequence dissolves entirely, with past, present and future becoming simultaneous, or where single moments expand to contain vast amounts of subjective experience. These altered states suggest that ordinary temporal experience represents just one possible mode of conscious temporal organization rather than the only way consciousness could relate to time. They reveal that the present moment is more flexible and malleable than normal experience suggests. Near-death experiences provide particularly dramatic examples of temporal distortion, where people report experiencing extended complex narratives during brief periods when their brains show minimal activity. During cardiac arrest, when brain activity is severely compromised, some people report detailed life reviews, encounters with deceased relatives, and profound spiritual experiences that feel like they last for extended periods. These experiences raise difficult questions about the relationship between neural activity and conscious temporal experience because they seem to occur when normal temporal processing mechanisms are not functioning. Skeptical explanations suggest that these experiences actually occur during recovery periods when normal brain function is resuming. But this requires compressed temporal processing that still challenges normal understanding of how consciousness constructs duration. Whether these experiences reveal genuine separation between consciousness and neural activity, or just unusual forms of neural temporal processing, they demonstrate that temporal experience can transcend normal biological constraints under extreme circumstances. The present moment shows remarkable capacity for expansion beyond ordinary limits. Cultural differences in temporal orientation reveal how social learning shapes the construction of present moment experience. Cultures that emphasize future planning and goal achievement create present moments that are constantly oriented toward upcoming outcomes and deadlines. Cultures that emphasize ancestral wisdom and traditional practices create present moments that are heavily influenced by past knowledge and established patterns. Cultures that emphasize immediate experience and present moment awareness create present moments that are less dominated by temporal projection and more focused on immediate circumstances. These cultural variations suggest that the character of present moment experience is partly learned rather than purely natural, shaped by social values and practices that influence how individuals relate to temporal flow. The now becomes culturally constructed while remaining grounded in universal features of consciousness and neural activity that operate across all human societies. Part 19. Information and the Present. Information theory provides a powerful framework for understanding the present moment as the place where new information comes into existence through physical interactions that resolve uncertainty into definite facts. Information exists only when it makes a difference to some system capable of detecting and responding to that information. Before two systems interact, their mutual relationship remains uncertain, with multiple possible outcomes existing simultaneously. During their interaction, this uncertainty resolves into definite information about what actually occurred, creating facts that become part of the historical record available to future interactions. The present moment can be defined as where this resolution of uncertainty into definite information currently takes place throughout the universe. This makes the now fundamentally active rather than passive, involving continuous creation of new facts rather than just revelation of facts that already existed. This information-theoretic approach connects naturally to quantum mechanical descriptions of measurement and observation. Quantum systems exist in superposition states that contain multiple incompatible possibilities until measurement interactions force them to exhibit definite classical properties. Each measurement creates new information that did not exist before the interaction occurred, transforming quantum uncertainty into classical definiteness. The present moment becomes where quantum information gets converted into classical information through decoherence processes that operate continuously throughout the natural world. This conversion process does not require conscious observers, but occurs whenever quantum systems interact with their environments in ways that create irreversible entanglement relationships. The now represents the advancing edge of this quantum to classical transition, where indefinite possibilities become definite actualities through natural physical processes. Digital physics theories take this information approach even further by proposing that reality might be fundamentally computational, with each present moment representing a discrete computational step in a universal information processing system. According to these theories, The universe operates like a vast computer program that calculates its next state based on its current state according to the laws of physics implemented as computational rules. Each computational cycle creates a new present moment by transforming the previous state into the subsequent state through information processing operations. Time emerges from this computational process rather than being a fundamental dimension in which computation occurs. The present moment becomes atomic and discrete, lasting for exactly one computational step with no temporal structure within individual steps. This digital view makes temporal flow similar to the discrete frame updates in computer simulations rather than continuous change in analog systems. Information integration theory provides another perspective on how consciousness creates present moment experience through the global integration of information across different brain systems. According to this theory, consciousness corresponds to integrated information that becomes globally available rather than remaining locally processed within individual neural modules. The present moment of consciousness emerges when different types of information get integrated into unified representations that combine sensory, memory, emotional, and cognitive components into coherent experiences. This integration requires active neural processes that bind distributed information into global patterns, creating conscious access to integrated information that would otherwise remain unconscious and fragmented. The quality and richness of present moment experience depends on the amount and type of information that gets successfully integrated rather than on the duration of objective time intervals. This explains why some brief moments feel incredibly rich and meaningful, while some extended periods feel empty and insignificant. The concept of mutual information reveals how present moment consciousness involves two-way information exchange between different components of experience rather than just passive reception of sensory input. When you recognize a familiar face, information flows from current visual input to stored memories, but information also flows from memories back to current perception, influencing what you actually see. This bidirectional information flow creates present moment experience that involves both bottom-up data-driven processing and top-down knowledge-driven processing operating simultaneously. The present becomes a place where different information streams converge and interact, rather than where single information sources get passively registered. Understanding consciousness requires understanding these complex information dynamics rather than treating present moment experience as simple input-output processing. The now emerges from information integration processes that actively construct temporal experience rather than just measuring temporal intervals. Part 20. Social construction of time. Human societies have created elaborate cultural frameworks for organizing and understanding temporal experience that profoundly shape how individuals experience the present moment. These social constructions of time involve calendars, clocks, schedules, deadlines, and temporal rituals that coordinate collective activity while also influencing personal temporal experience. Different cultures have developed dramatically different temporal frameworks, suggesting that much of what seems natural and obvious about time is actually learned and culturally specific rather than universal. Some cultures emphasize cyclical time connected to agricultural seasons and religious festivals. Others emphasize linear historical progress toward future goals, and still others focus on eternal present moments that transcend temporal flow entirely. These cultural variations reveal that the meaning and significance of the present moment depends partly on the social context within which temporal experience occurs. The now becomes culturally mediated rather than purely individual, shaped by shared symbols and practices that influence how particular present moments are interpreted and valued. The invention and widespread adoption of mechanical clocks represents one of the most profound transformations in human temporal experience in recorded history. Before mechanical timekeeping, people organized their daily activities around natural temporal rhythms like sunrise and sunset, seasonal changes, hunger and fatigue, and social events that had their own organic temporal logic. The present moment was defined by immediate circumstances, biological needs, and natural cycles, rather than by abstract temporal coordinates that remain constant regardless of actual conditions. Mechanical clocks created uniform mathematical time that divides the day into identical units that can be measured, exchanged and coordinated across large geographical areas regardless of local circumstances. This mechanization of time enables complex social coordination and technological development, but also creates alienation from natural temporal rhythms that evolved over millions of years. The industrial present moment becomes standardized and abstract rather than lived and concrete, measured by mechanical devices rather than felt through biological and social processes. Digital technology has created entirely new forms of temporal experience that compress, fragment and multiply the present moment in unprecedented ways. Social media platforms create continuous streams of present moments from other people's lives, blending your immediate now with countless other nows from different times and places. Smartphones and constant connectivity mean that present moment experience gets interrupted by temporal demands from other contexts through notifications, messages and digital distractions that fragment attention across multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously. Virtual reality technologies can create immersive present moments that feel more immediate and engaging than ordinary physical reality, raising questions about what makes some present moments more real than others. Video games create parallel temporal universes with their own internal temporal logic, where players can pause, restart or save and reload present moments in ways that have no analogue in ordinary temporal experience. These technological developments suggest that human temporal experience continues to evolve as new tools and social practices create novel possibilities for relating to time. The global synchronization of temporal experience through digital communication creates new forms of shared present moments that transcend geographical limitations. Live streaming, video calls and social media allow people to participate in common present moments despite being physically located in different time zones and cultural contexts. This global temporal connectivity creates hybrid present moments that combine local immediate circumstances with distant shared experiences in ways that would have been impossible before digital technology. The distinction between local and distant present moments becomes blurred when digital communication allows real-time participation in geographically dispersed events. These technological possibilities raise questions about whether the present moment necessarily involves physical co-presence or whether shared temporal attention can create genuine present moments across space through information connection. The now becomes potentially global rather than necessarily local, distributed across digital networks rather than confined to immediate physical circumstances. Economic systems create temporal frameworks that profoundly influence how individuals experience and value present moments. Capitalist economies emphasize future-oriented investment and productivity maximization that can make present moments feel valuable only insofar as they contribute to future economic outcomes. This economic temporal orientation can create anxiety and restlessness, where present moment experience gets constantly evaluated in terms of its efficiency and productive value rather than its intrinsic qualities. Alternative economic frameworks like gift economies or subsistence economies create different temporal relationships where present moment sharing and immediate need satisfaction take priority over future accumulation. These economic differences reveal how social structures shape the meaning and value assigned to present moments, rather than just providing neutral frameworks within which temporal experience occurs. The metaphysics of now includes political and economic dimensions that influence whether particular present moments are experienced as valuable, meaningful, stressful, or alienating. Part 21. The Eternal Return. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence represents one of the most psychologically and metaphysically challenging ideas about time and the present moment ever developed in Western philosophy. Nietzsche asked what would happen if you discovered that your entire life would repeat exactly the same way infinite times, with every thought, feeling, action and experience recurring eternally without the slightest variation. This is not reincarnation, where you might live different lives or have opportunities to improve through learning from past mistakes. Instead, it is the exact repetition of this particular life with all its joys and sufferings, successes and failures, wise choices and foolish errors recurring infinitely. Nietzsche argued that truly accepting this possibility would require a fundamental transformation in how you relate to each present moment, because every moment would carry the weight of eternal repetition. Each now would become infinitely significant because it would be repeated infinitely, making temporary experiences eternally consequential. The eternal return functions as both a cosmological hypothesis about the nature of time and a psychological test that reveals your fundamental attitude toward existence. As a cosmological theory, it suggests that time might be cyclical rather than linear, with the universe eventually returning to previous states and repeating its entire history. If the universe contains a finite amount of matter and energy distributed through finite space, then the number of possible configurations is also finite, making eventual repetition mathematically inevitable given infinite time. However, Nietzsche was more interested in the psychological impact of seriously considering this possibility than in defending it as a scientific theory about actual cosmic processes. The eternal return serves as a thought experiment that forces honest evaluation of whether you can affirm your life completely rather than just accepting it conditionally, based on hopes for future improvement. It eliminates the possibility of justifying present suffering through appeal to future compensation, making each moment valuable or terrible in itself rather than as a means to something else. Accepting the eternal return requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, which involves embracing everything that happens, including suffering, failure and limitation as necessary parts of existence rather than obstacles to be overcome. This does not mean passive resignation, but active affirmation that says yes to the totality of life, including its most difficult aspects. The person who can genuinely accept eternal recurrence has overcome what Nietzsche saw as the life-denying aspects of traditional morality and religion that encourage people to reject aspects of existence in favor of transcendent ideals. Instead of seeking escape from temporal existence into eternal salvation, amor fati finds eternity within time itself through complete acceptance of temporal experience. The present moment becomes sacred, not because it points beyond itself towards something eternal, but because it participates in eternal repetition that makes temporal experience itself eternal. This transforms the meaning of the now from a temporary phase in progress toward transcendence into an eternal reality that deserves complete affirmation. The eternal return also raises profound questions about personal identity and what persists through repetition. If your life repeats exactly, is each repetition a different life lived by different people who happen to be identical? Or is it the same life experienced multiple times by the same person? This depends on what makes you the particular individual you are, rather than someone else with similar or identical characteristics. If personal identity depends on psychological continuity, through memory and character development, then each repetition creates a new person who starts fresh without memory of previous cycles. If personal identity depends on some deeper metaphysical essence, then the same person might experience multiple identical lives, with the strange situation of reliving experiences that feel completely new each time. The eternal return forces careful thinking about what makes present moments uniquely yours, rather than just anonymous temporal events that happen to occur where you are located. Nietzsche connected the eternal return to his broader philosophical project of overcoming nihilism and creating new values after the death of God and traditional metaphysical foundations. If there is no transcendent realm that gives ultimate meaning to temporal existence, then meaning must be created within temporal existence itself, rather than being discovered through revelation or rational demonstration. The eternal return provides a test for values that can survive the elimination of transcendent foundations by requiring affirmation that does not depend on external validation or future compensation. Values that can survive eternal repetition must be intrinsically valuable rather than instrumentally valuable, good in themselves rather than good for achieving something else. This creates what Nietzsche called a transvaluation of values, where traditional distinctions between good and evil get replaced by distinctions between life-affirming and life-denying attitudes toward existence. The present moment becomes where this creative revaluation occurs through the choices and commitments that reveal what you can genuinely affirm rather than just temporarily tolerate. Part 22. Process Philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead developed a comprehensive philosophical system that makes temporal becoming the fundamental feature of reality, rather than treating it as something that requires explanation in terms of more basic non-temporal concepts. According to Whitehead's process philosophy, everything that exists is composed of what he called actual occasions of experience, discrete events of becoming that are the ultimate constituents of reality. Each actual occasion is a moment of creative synthesis, where the influence of past occasions gets integrated with novel creative response to generate something genuinely new that then becomes available for future occasions to take into account. The present moment is not just where things happen, but where things come into existence for the first time through creative processes that cannot be reduced to mechanical causation or predetermined development. Reality consists entirely of these creative temporal events rather than of enduring substances that persist through time, making temporal becoming ontologically fundamental rather than derivative. This process, metaphysics, treats the now as the basic building block of existence, rather than as an emergent property of more fundamental non-temporal entities. Whitehead's actual occasions have complex internal temporal structure that reveals how creativity and determinism can coexist within individual present moments. Each occasion begins with what Whitehead called the physical pole, which involves prehending or taking account of what has already become actual in its relevant environment. This prehension is not optional, but represents the way that past actualities provide data and constraints for new creative synthesis. The occasion then integrates these inherited influences through its mental pole, which involves creative response that determines how inherited possibilities will be actualized in this particular context. Finally, the occasion reaches satisfaction, where it becomes a completed actual entity, available for future occasions to prehend in their own creative synthesis. This process of prehension, integration, and satisfaction constitutes the internal temporal structure of every present moment, making each now a complete cycle of creative becoming rather than just a point in external temporal flow. The creativity involved in actual occasions operates within constraints provided by past actualities, while generating genuine novelty that cannot be predicted from those constraints alone. Each occasion must take account of its past, but it has freedom in how it responds to that past and what it makes of inherited possibilities. This creativity is not arbitrary, but involves what Whitehead called the mental pole's capacity to envision alternative ways of integrating inherited data into new actualized forms. The present moment becomes where cosmic creativity operates through particular finite perspectives rather than where predetermined patterns simply unfold according to external laws. This makes each now genuinely creative and significant rather than just a temporary phase in mechanical processes, but it also makes creativity finite and contextual rather than absolute and unlimited. Every present moment involves real choice among genuine alternatives. But the alternatives available depend on what has been inherited from the past and what remains possible given current constraints. Whitehead's philosophy extends this temporal analysis to all levels of reality, arguing that even apparently lifeless matter consists of actual occasions that involve primitive forms of experience and creativity. Electrons, atoms and molecules are societies of actual occasions that exhibit extremely simple and repetitive patterns of creative response, but that still involve genuine becoming rather than just mechanical interaction. This panpsychist approach makes consciousness and temporal becoming universal features of reality rather than special properties that emerge only in complex biological systems. The difference between conscious and unconscious beings lies in the complexity and integration of their constituent occasions, rather than in the presence or absence of experience and temporality altogether. This creates a continuous spectrum from simple physical processes to complex conscious experience, rather than a sharp divide between temporal conscious minds and timeless unconscious matter. Every level of reality participates in temporal becoming through its own characteristic patterns of creative response to inherited influences. The theological implications of process philosophy transform traditional concepts of divine eternity and temporal creation. Whitehead argued that God exists as the primordial actual entity who provides initial aims for all finite actual occasions, but who also includes a consequent nature that experiences and preserves the achievements of temporal creation. This dipolar theism makes God both eternal and temporal, unchanging in essential character but growing in experiential content through participation in cosmic creativity. The present moment becomes where finite creativity contributes to divine experience rather than just where divine creativity expresses itself in finite form. This creates genuine interaction between divine and finite reality, rather than just one-way dependence of finite on infinite being. God becomes the ultimate repository of temporal achievements rather than a transcendent reality unaffected by temporal processes, making every present moment cosmically significant as a contribution to divine experience and universal beauty. Part 23. The specious present. William James introduced the concept of the specious present to address fundamental problems with both mathematical and philosophical approaches to temporal experience that treat the present as an instantaneous point with no temporal extension. James observed that consciousness never actually experiences mathematical instants, but always experiences temporal intervals that feel unified and present rather than extended and successive. When you hear someone speak a sentence, the individual words do not feel like separate temporal events connected only by memory and anticipation. Instead, the entire sentence feels like a unified present moment utterance that you grasp as a whole rather than reconstructing from temporal parts. This requires that consciousness somehow hold on to the immediate past while anticipating the immediate future within a single experience moment that has genuine temporal thickness. The specious present is this temporal holding capacity that creates meaningful duration from what would otherwise be disconnected mathematical points. James distinguished the specious present from both memory and perception in ways that reveal its unique temporal character. Memory involves awareness of events that are recognized as past, requiring explicit temporal distancing and often involving effort to recall details that are not immediately available. Perception involves awareness of events that feel immediate and current, requiring no temporal distancing or effortful retrieval. The specious present includes events that feel immediate and current, even though they are objectively past, creating a zone of temporal experience that bridges the gap between perception and memory. This bridging function explains how consciousness can experience temporal flow and change without losing its sense of present moment immediacy. The specious present allows you to experience becoming rather than just being, process rather than just state, melody rather than just individual notes. Experimental psychology has measured the duration and characteristics of the specious present under controlled laboratory conditions, revealing systematic patterns that illuminate how consciousness constructs temporal experience. For most people under normal conditions, the specious present lasts between 2 and 3 seconds, representing the maximum temporal interval within which events feel truly simultaneous rather than sequential. If you hear two sounds separated by more than 3 seconds, they feel like distinct events that require memory to connect. If they are separated by less than 3 seconds, they feel like parts of the same event that consciousness grasps as a unified temporal whole. This 3-second window appears to represent a fundamental constraint on temporal integration in human consciousness, though the exact duration varies based on attention, emotion, age, and individual differences. The specious present provides a natural unit of temporal experience that is neither instantaneous like mathematical points nor indefinitely extensible like memory spans. The specious present varies systematically in different circumstances in ways that reveal the active construction processes underlying temporal experience. When you are highly focused and alert, the specious present can expand to accommodate more temporal information and longer integration windows. Athletes in flow states report expanded present moments that allow them to perceive and respond to complex temporal patterns that would normally exceed conscious integration capacity. Musicians performing complex pieces describe similar expansions of present moment awareness that allow them to hold entire musical phrases or sections in immediate awareness rather than just individual notes. Conversely, when you are tired, distracted or emotionally stressed, the specious present contracts and temporal experience becomes more fragmented and disconnected. These variations suggest that the duration and quality of present moment experience depend on the current state and training of attentional and integrative mechanisms rather than being fixed features of consciousness. Disorders of temporal processing reveal how the specious present depends on specific neural mechanisms that can be disrupted by brain injury, psychiatric conditions, or developmental differences. People with autism spectrum disorders often show differences in temporal processing that affect their specious present, sometimes leading to enhanced ability to perceive brief temporal intervals, but reduced ability to integrate longer temporal sequences. Patients with schizophrenia sometimes experience fragmented specious presence where temporal integration fails, and consciousness becomes disconnected from coherent temporal flow. Alzheimer's disease progressively destroys the neural mechanisms that support temporal integration, eventually eliminating the capacity for coherent present-moment experience entirely. These clinical cases demonstrate that the specious present represents a specific achievement of neural organization, rather than an automatic feature of any conscious system. They also reveal how dependent normal temporal experience is on neural health and proper functioning of brain systems that are often taken for granted. The relationship between the specious present and attention reveals how consciousness actively constructs temporal experience rather than passively receiving temporal information. Paying attention to temporal features of experience can expand the specious present by enhancing temporal integration and making subtle temporal relationships more apparent. Meditation practices that cultivate present-moment awareness often involve training attention to rest within the specious present rather than getting carried away by memory, and planning that extend beyond immediate temporal integration. This attentional training can gradually expand the capacity for present-moment awareness and reduce the tendency for consciousness to fragment across different temporal contexts. The specious present becomes something that can be developed and enhanced rather than just a fixed constraint on temporal experience. This developmental potential suggests that present-moment awareness represents a skill that can be cultivated rather than just a natural capacity that operates automatically. Part 24. Mystical Traditions. Mystical traditions throughout human history have developed sophisticated practices and conceptual frameworks for exploring dimensions of present-moment awareness that transcend ordinary temporal limitations and reveal what practitioners describe as timeless or eternal aspects of consciousness. These traditions agree that normal temporal experience, while necessary for practical life, conceals deeper temporal realities that can be accessed through contemplative practice, grace, or sudden illumination. The timeless present described in mystical literature is not simply an extended version of ordinary present moments, but a qualitatively different mode of awareness that transcends the usual distinctions between past, present, and future altogether. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart describe this as participation in God's eternal now, where divine presence encompasses all temporal moments without being limited by temporal succession or change. This eternal now is not located at any particular time, but is equally present at all times, making every temporal moment a potential gateway to eternal experience. The mystical present transforms ordinary temporal experience from within rather than replacing it with something entirely different. Islamic Sufism has developed particularly detailed analyses of different levels of temporal experience that lead towards the eternal moment of direct divine encounter. Sufi teachers distinguish between ordinary time dominated by ego concerns and desires, sacred time structured by religious practices and remembrance of God, and eternal time where individual consciousness dissolves into divine consciousness. Each level involves different qualities of present-moment experience, from the fragmented and anxious now of ego consciousness to the peaceful and integrated now of sacred practice to the unified and blissful now of mystical union. The progression through these levels involves purification of temporal experience rather than escape from temporality altogether. Advanced Sufi practice aims to bring the quality of eternal presence into ordinary temporal activities rather than seeking permanent residence in mystical states that are disconnected from practical life. This integration creates what Sufis call perfect servanthood, where every present moment becomes an opportunity for divine service and remembrance. Hindu Advaita Vedanta offers perhaps the most systematic philosophical analysis of timeless consciousness and its relationship to temporal experience. According to Advaitic teaching, ultimate reality or Brahman is pure consciousness that exists beyond all temporal limitations and modifications. Individual consciousness appears to be temporal because it identifies with changing mental and physical processes, but this identification is based on ignorance of consciousness's true nature. Through contemplative inquiry and direct investigation, consciousness can discover its own timeless essence that was never actually limited by temporal experience, despite appearances. The present moment becomes the gateway to this discovery because it is the only time when direct investigation of consciousness is possible, rather than just thinking about consciousness conceptually. But the timeless awareness revealed through this investigation transcends the present moment itself, showing that consciousness is neither temporal nor eternal, but beyond both temporal categories entirely. Buddhist Zen tradition has developed unique approaches to present-moment awareness that aim to transcend conceptual thinking about time rather than developing theories about temporal metaphysics. Zen practice involves direct pointing to present-moment awareness without getting caught in philosophical analysis of what this awareness is or how it relates to time. The famous question, "What is this?" points attention toward immediate present experience before conceptual interpretation has time to arise and obscure direct awareness. Advanced Zen practice can lead to what teachers call great doubt, where conceptual certainties about time, self and world dissolve entirely, followed by great awakening where present moment awareness reveals its own timeless nature. This awakening is described as sudden recognition of what was always already present rather than gradual development of new capacities or understanding. The Zen present transcends both time and timelessness by revealing the futility of all conceptual approaches to ultimate reality. Contemporary scientific research on contemplative practices has begun to provide neural and psychological explanations for mystical temporal experiences without necessarily reducing them to mere brain states. Advanced meditation practitioners show distinctive patterns of brain activity during states of timeless awareness, including decreased activity in regions associated with narrative self-processing and increased coherence in networks associated with present-moment attention. These changes suggest that mystical experiences involve genuine modifications of neural temporal processing rather than just changes in how people interpret ordinary experiences. However, the relationship between neural changes and reported experiential changes remains complex and controversial. Contemplatives argue that neuroscience can study the conditions that allow access to timeless awareness without being able to study timeless awareness itself, which transcends the temporal categories that science uses to organize its investigations. This creates an ongoing dialogue between scientific and contemplative approaches to understanding consciousness and temporality that enriches both traditions while preserving their distinctive methodological commitments. Part 25. The Future of Now. Advances in artificial intelligence, virtual reality and biotechnology are creating new questions about the nature of present moment experience that will likely reshape human understanding of consciousness and temporality in fundamental ways. As artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated, questions arise about whether machines could develop genuine present moment awareness or whether consciousness is necessary for temporal experience at all. Current AI systems process temporal information and can exhibit complex temporal behaviors, but whether they experience anything analogous to the flowing present that characterizes human consciousness remains an open question. If artificial minds could experience their own version of now, this would suggest that present moment awareness depends more on information processing patterns than on biological neural networks. If only biological consciousness can experience genuine present moments, this would indicate that temporality is more intimately connected to life and organic processes than to abstract computational operations. The answer will influence whether we understand the present moment as a universal feature of complex information processing or as a special characteristic of biological consciousness. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are creating unprecedented possibilities for manipulating and extending present moment experience in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about the relationship between presence and physical location. Advanced VR systems can create compelling experiences of being present in environments that do not physically exist or that existed at different times in history. Users report genuine feelings of presence in virtual environments that can be more emotionally engaging than many real-world experiences. This raises questions about what constitutes genuine presence, and whether the present moment necessarily involves physical embodiment in particular spatial locations. Augmented reality systems overlay digital information on physical environments, creating hybrid present moments that combine immediate physical circumstances with virtual elements that exist only in digital form. These technologies suggest that present moment experience might be more flexible and constructible than traditional philosophical analysis suggested. Brain-computer interfaces represent an emerging technology that could directly modify neural processes underlying temporal experience, potentially allowing unprecedented control over the construction of present moments. These interfaces might eventually allow people to share present moment experiences directly through neural connection rather than through external communication. They could also allow artificial modification of temporal processing to expand or contract subjective duration, enhance temporal integration, or create entirely new forms of temporal experience. Such technologies raise ethical questions about the integrity of personal temporal experience and whether artificial modification of consciousness represents enhancement or corruption of human nature. They also raise philosophical questions about whether technologically modified temporal experience would reveal new truths about the nature of consciousness and time, or would create artificial experiences that obscure natural temporal relationships. The future development of these technologies will likely force reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about what constitutes natural and authentic temporal experience. Climate change and environmental crisis create new temporal frameworks that extend present-moment responsibility across geological timescales in ways that challenge individual-centered approaches to temporal ethics. Current human actions are shaping planetary conditions for thousands of years into the future through greenhouse gas emissions, species extinctions, and ecosystem modifications that will persist long after current generations have died. This creates a responsibility to extend moral consideration beyond the immediate consequences of present-moment choices to include impacts on future generations and non-human life forms. The present moment becomes embedded in deep time narratives that connect individual actions to planetary processes operating on scales that dwarf human historical experience. Understanding these connections requires new forms of temporal thinking that can hold together immediate present experience with long-term ecological consequences in ways that make deep time impacts emotionally and morally relevant to present moment choice. The metaphysics of now must grapple with how individual present moments participate in and influence these vast temporal structures that extend far beyond personal lifespans. Space exploration and the possibility of interstellar travel raise questions about how present moment experience would be affected by extreme time dilation and separation from Earth-based temporal frameworks. Astronauts traveling at speeds approaching the speed of light would experience time dilation effects that make their present moments pass much more slowly relative to Earth-based observers. A journey that lasted years, from the astronaut's perspective, might correspond to centuries or millennia from Earth's perspective, creating radically divergent present moments for beings who originated from the same temporal context. This temporal separation would challenge personal identity and social connection in ways that might require new concepts of shared presence and communication across different temporal frameworks. Interstellar travel would also involve isolation from the immediate environmental and social cues that normally help coordinate present moment experience with natural and cultural rhythms. The psychology and philosophy of present moment experience under such extreme conditions remains largely speculative, but might become practically important as space technology advances toward making such travel possible. Part 26. Practical Implications. The philosophical analysis of the present moment has direct practical implications for how we approach mental health, relationships, education, and the pursuit of meaningful life that extend far beyond academic theorizing. If the present is the only time that truly exists, or the only time where agency can be exercised, then learning to inhabit present moments skillfully becomes the most important capacity for psychological well-being and ethical action. Mindfulness-based therapeutic approaches have demonstrated that training attention to rest in immediate experience can significantly reduce anxiety, depression, and chronic pain by interrupting psychological patterns that involve temporal displacement. Anxiety typically involves projection into imaginary future problems that may never occur, while depression often involves rumination about past disappointments that cannot be changed. Both conditions involve leaving the present moment where actual choice and response remain possible in favor of temporal contexts where agency is impossible because the past cannot be changed and the future has not yet arrived. Returning attention to present circumstances can restore psychological balance by reconnecting consciousness with the temporal location where effective action remains possible. However, mindfulness practice involves more than just focusing attention on present sensations or thoughts. Skillful present moment awareness requires understanding the temporal structure of consciousness itself, including how memory and anticipation operate within present experience rather than taking you away from it. When you remember something while remaining present, the memory appears within current awareness rather than displacing current awareness toward a different temporal context. Similarly, planning and anticipation can occur within present moment consciousness rather than requiring psychological travel into future scenarios. This distinction between present-centered memory and future-oriented memory, or between present-centered planning and future-displaced fantasizing, becomes crucial for developing sustainable and psychologically healthy relationships to temporal experience. The goal is not to eliminate memory and planning, but to discover how they can operate within present awareness rather than against it. Interpersonal relationships are profoundly affected by the quality of present moment awareness that people bring to their interactions with others. Genuine presence with another person requires temporarily setting aside personal temporal concerns, like future plans and past grievances, in order to attend fully to what is happening in the shared now of interaction. This quality of presence creates intimacy and trust, because it demonstrates that you value the current relationship more than competing temporal distractions. People can sense when others are genuinely present versus when they are physically present but mentally elsewhere, and this sensing significantly impacts the quality of communication and emotional connection. In a culture dominated by digital distractions and temporal fragmentation, the capacity for genuine present moment attention in relationships becomes increasingly rare and valuable. Developing this capacity requires understanding how temporal attention operates and practicing the skills necessary to maintain present focus despite internal and external temporal pressures. Educational approaches that incorporate understanding of present moment awareness can enhance learning by working with rather than against the natural temporal structure of consciousness. Traditional educational methods often fragment learning into discrete temporal units that fail to support the temporal integration necessary for deep understanding. Students are expected to memorize information in one temporal context, apply it in different temporal contexts, and integrate it with other information across extended time periods without adequate support for these temporal synthesis processes. Teaching methods that honor the specious present, by presenting information in temporally integrated chunks that can be grasped as unified wholes, tend to be more effective than methods that present information in disconnected temporal fragments. This suggests that educational theory should incorporate insights from philosophy and psychology of temporal experience, rather than treating temporal factors as merely external constraints on learning processes. The present moment becomes the natural unit of learning and understanding, rather than just the temporal location where learning happens to occur. The pursuit of meaningful life requires understanding how present moment experience relates to longer-term temporal narratives without sacrificing present satisfaction to future achievement or past nostalgia. Many approaches to personal development and self-help emphasize future goal achievement in ways that treat present moments as valuable only insofar as they contribute to desired future outcomes. While planning and goal pursuit are important human capacities, exclusive focus on future outcomes can create chronic dissatisfaction with present circumstances and prevent appreciation of present moment value. Conversely, exclusive focus on present experience, without regard for longer-term consequences, can lead to impulsive behavior and failure to develop lasting sources of satisfaction and meaning. Wisdom involves learning to hold together present moment awareness with appropriate temporal extension that includes past learning and future responsibility, without sacrificing present appreciation to temporal anxiety. This integration requires understanding how present moments can be intrinsically valuable while also serving instrumental functions in larger temporal narratives that give life coherence and direction. Part 27. The Paradox of Temporal Experience. The deepest philosophical problem about the present moment emerges when we attempt to study temporal experience itself, revealing fundamental limitations in how consciousness can investigate its own temporal nature. The moment you turn introspective attention toward your current experience, that experience has already become past by the time observation and analysis occur. The now that you try to observe has vanished by the time observation takes place, replaced by a new now that includes the observation activity itself rather than the original experience being observed. This creates a fundamental epistemological problem about whether direct knowledge of present moment experience is possible, or whether consciousness is always temporally displaced from its objects of investigation. We seem to be perpetually chasing ourselves, gaining knowledge only of what has just happened rather than what is happening right now. This temporal lag raises questions about whether immediate experience is truly immediate or whether consciousness necessarily involves temporal distance from whatever it observes. This observational problem connects to broader questions in philosophy of mind about the relationship between consciousness and self-consciousness. Present moment awareness seems to operate automatically without requiring explicit attention or analysis, but as soon as you become self-consciously aware of being aware, the original spontaneous awareness gets modified by the self-conscious observation process. This creates what philosophers call the transparency problem. Consciousness seems to disappear when you try to observe it directly, like trying to see your own eyes without using a mirror. The present moment of pure awareness might be accessible only when it is not being observed, which means that any attempt to study it scientifically or philosophically necessarily misses what is most essential about it. This suggests that understanding consciousness and temporal experience might require methods other than objective observation and analysis, including contemplative approaches that work with rather than against the reflexivity of consciousness. The now reveals itself only to awareness that is not trying to grasp or understand it conceptually. Some philosophers argue that this observational lag reveals the fundamentally constructed nature of temporal experience rather than just creating epistemic problems about accessing temporal reality. What we call the present moment might be a synthesis created by consciousness from recent past experiences and immediate future expectations, rather than direct perception of current actuality. This construction process happens so quickly and automatically that it feels like immediate perception. But careful analysis reveals the complex temporal integration involved in creating present-moment experience. Understanding consciousness becomes a matter of understanding these constructive processes rather than trying to access some pure present that exists before construction occurs. From this perspective, the temporal lag in self-observation is not a limitation that prevents access to the real present, but evidence for how present-moment experience actually works through temporal synthesis rather than immediate presence. The now emerges from temporal construction processes rather than being given as a simple datum of consciousness. However, this constructivist analysis might go too far in making temporal experience purely subjective and losing contact with the temporal features of reality that consciousness must track in order to function effectively. Even if consciousness constructs its experience of the present moment, this construction must be constrained by and responsive to real temporal relationships in the environment and the body. The fact that temporal construction is possible and generally accurate suggests that reality has temporal structure that consciousness can detect and integrate even if not directly perceive. The present moment emerges from the interaction between objective temporal processes and subjective temporal synthesis rather than being either purely objective or purely subjective. Neither pure realism nor pure constructivism adequately captures the complex relationship between consciousness and time that creates present-moment experience. The now represents a genuine meeting place between mind and world in temporal experience, rather than being located entirely on either the mental or physical side of this relationship. The reflexivity problem in studying consciousness connects to broader questions about the limits of scientific method when applied to subjective phenomena. Science typically requires objective observation of phenomena that exist independently of the observation process. But consciousness seems to be essentially subjective and reactive to observation. This does not necessarily mean that consciousness cannot be studied scientifically, But it does suggest that studying consciousness requires methodological innovations that can accommodate reflexivity and subjectivity rather than eliminating them. Some researchers argue for neurophenomenology, which combines objective neuroscience with rigorous first-person investigation of subjective experience to create more complete understanding of consciousness than either approach can achieve alone. Others propose that consciousness studies requires contemplative science that incorporates meditative and introspective methods alongside experimental and theoretical approaches. The present moment becomes a test case for whether science can expand its methods to include subjective phenomena or whether some aspects of reality necessarily remain beyond scientific investigation. The paradox of temporal experience also reveals important truths about the relationship between intellectual understanding and direct experience that apply beyond temporal questions to consciousness studies generally. No amount of theoretical knowledge about the present moment can substitute for direct present moment awareness, yet direct awareness alone cannot answer the conceptual questions that theoretical investigation addresses. Understanding the present moment fully requires both rigorous conceptual analysis and sustained contemplative investigation. But these two approaches operate according to different principles and may even interfere with each other under some circumstances. Contemplative traditions often warn that excessive conceptual thinking can obstruct direct awareness, while philosophical traditions emphasize that direct experience without conceptual clarification can lead to confusion and self-deception. The challenge is developing approaches that can integrate both types of investigation without allowing either to undermine the other. This integration becomes crucial for any complete understanding of consciousness and temporality that hopes to be both rigorously accurate and experientially grounded. Part 28. The Eternal Mystery. After exploring 25 centuries of human reflection on the present moment through philosophy, science, contemplative practice, and cultural analysis, we discover that the mystery has deepened and enriched rather than being resolved into simple answers. Each approach reveals important truths about temporal experience while also uncovering new layers of complexity and paradox that require further investigation. The present moment appears simultaneously to be the most obvious and the most mysterious aspect of existence, the most immediate and the most elusive, the most natural and the most constructed. It provides the foundation for everything else we experience and understand, yet it resists all attempts at complete theoretical mastery. This resistance might not represent a failure of human understanding, but an essential feature of what makes the present moment special and significant. Perhaps some realities are meant to be lived rather than solved, participated in rather than explained, embraced rather than grasped conceptually. The interdisciplinary nature of present moment studies reveals how artificial the boundaries between different areas of human knowledge become when investigating fundamental questions about consciousness and reality. Physics provides crucial insights about the temporal structure of space-time and the role of observation in quantum mechanics. But these insights require philosophical interpretation to understand their implications for conscious experience. Neuroscience reveals the neural mechanisms underlying temporal experience, but understanding what these mechanisms mean requires philosophical analysis of the relationship between brain activity and conscious awareness. Psychology documents the variations and pathologies of temporal experience, but explaining these phenomena requires metaphysical theories about the nature of consciousness and time. Contemplative traditions provide detailed first-person investigations of temporal awareness, but integrating these investigations with scientific knowledge requires philosophical frameworks that can bridge subjective and objective approaches. The present moment serves as a focal point where all these different approaches converge and inform each other. The practical significance of understanding the present moment extends beyond academic interest to influence how we approach fundamental questions about meaning, ethics, and human flourishing. How we understand the nature of now affects how we think about moral responsibility, the value of contemplative practice, the significance of death, and the possibility of genuine creativity and freedom. If the present moment is just an illusion created by consciousness, then many human concerns and practices that focus on present experience might be based on fundamental misunderstandings. If the present moment represents genuine temporal becoming, where new reality comes into existence, then present-focused approaches to ethics and spirituality gain metaphysical support. These implications make temporal metaphysics relevant to practical life rather than just to theoretical understanding, influencing how we structure societies, educational systems, therapeutic practices, and personal approaches to living well. The nature of the now affects everything from criminal justice policies to meditation techniques to environmental activism. The ongoing evolution of human understanding suggests that the metaphysics of the present moment will continue developing as new scientific discoveries, technological capabilities, and contemplative insights emerge. Future developments in quantum gravity might reveal whether time is fundamental or emergent at the deepest levels of physical reality. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence might clarify the relationship between information processing and conscious temporal experience. New contemplative technologies and practices might provide access to dimensions of temporal awareness that remain largely unexplored. Cross-cultural dialogue and global communication might generate new synthetic approaches that integrate insights from different temporal traditions in unprecedented ways. The present moment itself might evolve as human consciousness and technology create new possibilities for temporal experience. Perhaps the most important insight from this extensive exploration is that the present moment deserves sustained attention and investigation precisely because it resists easy understanding and continues to reveal new depths under careful examination. Whether approached through rigorous philosophical analysis, empirical scientific investigation, disciplined contemplative practice, or thoughtful practical application, the now rewards sustained engagement with insights that transform both understanding and experience. The metaphysics of the present moment is not just an abstract intellectual exercise, but an investigation into the fundamental nature of what it means to exist as conscious temporal beings in a temporal world. Every moment of this investigation occurs in some version of the present, making the study of the now simultaneously the method and the object of inquiry, in ways that create unique opportunities for self-transforming understanding. Understanding the present moment more deeply can transform every aspect of human existence by revealing the temporal foundations that normally remain invisible, but that shape everything from perception to action to meaning. The now remains eternally mysterious, not because it is unknowable, but because it is inexhaustibly rich, continuing to reveal new dimensions of significance to those who approach it with sufficient patience, rigor, and wonder.